Hi guys, tonight we explore how a land known for empires, poetry and quiet resilience slowly became what we now call Iran, a place where ancient memory still breathes beneath modern streets. You walk across a vast plateau, the air dry and cool, the horizon stretching far beyond what your eyes can fully take in. This is not yet Persia as history will remember it. There are no grand palaces, no kings carved into stone. Only scattered communities, early settlements, and people learning how to survive in a land that offers both abundance and challenge. The ground beneath your feet is firm, shaped by time and wind. Mountains rise in the distance, silent and protective. Somewhere nearby, a river cuts through the earth, bringing life to small clusters of homes built from mud and stone. Smoke rises slowly from simple fires, blending into the pale sky. A widely accepted historical understanding tells us that this region known today as the Iranian Plateau was inhabited by various early peoples thousands of years before the rise of any empire. These communities were not yet united by a single identity, but they shared something deeper, a relationship with the land itself. You move closer to one of these early settlements. The structures are modest yet carefully arranged. You notice how the homes are positioned to block the wind, how storage spaces are raised to keep food dry, how paths are worn into the earth by repeated footsteps. Nothing here is accidental. Every detail reflects experience passed down quietly across generations. There is a rhythm to life here. You can almost feel it as you stand among them. The slow preparation of food, the careful tending of animals, the awareness of seasons shifting sometimes gently, sometimes without warning, and yet something more subtle is beginning to take shape. Some researchers suggest that even in these early communities long before Persia was ever named, there were already shared cultural patterns forming across the plateau. Not a unified nation, but a kind of invisible thread connecting distant groups through trade migration and shared survival strategies. You imagine travellers moving between settlements carrying not only goods but ideas, stories spoken softly by firelight, techniques for farming in dry soil, ways to store water to survive harsh winters to navigate the open land. It's here in these quiet exchanges that the first outlines of something larger begin to emerge. A lesser-known detail is that early inhabitants of this region developed sophisticated systems for managing water, including underground channels known as qanats. These allowed communities to access water from distant sources without losing it to evaporation under the harsh sun. You can picture the effort involved, digging carefully through earth and stone, creating lifelines that would sustain entire settlements. You pause near one such channel, imagining the cool water flowing beneath your feet, unseen but essential. Life here is not easy, but it is not chaotic either. It is structured, intentional. The people understand their environment in ways that go far beyond simple observation. They adapt, adjust, and slowly shape the land as much as it shapes them. As you continue walking, the landscape shifts subtly. The terrain rises, the air cools slightly, and the settlements become more spread out. You begin to sense how vast this region truly is, how difficult it would be to unify it, how unlikely it might seem that one day a single power could connect all of this into something recognizable as an empire. Historians still debate whether the early cultural unity of the Iranian plateau was strong enough to be considered the foundation of later Persian identity, or if that identity only formed much later under powerful rulers. As you stand here, in this earlier time, the answer does not feel obvious. What you see instead is potential. You notice how people mark their surroundings with small symbols, patterns etched into pottery, shapes repeated in woven materials. These are not just decorations, they are expressions of meaning, early forms of identity, perhaps even belief systems beginning to take form. There is also a quiet awareness of the sky. You see individuals looking upward at night, tracking the movement of stars. Not in a formal scientific way, but with a sense that these patterns matter, that they are connected somehow to the cycles of life below. You begin to understand that even before Persia becomes a name before kings and empires, this land is already shaping a way of thinking, a way of seeing the world that balances order and uncertainty, survival and meaning. The wind moves softly across the plateau now. It carries with it the scent of earth and distant fire. You feel a calm settle in, as if time itself is moving more slowly here. Earlier, you might have expected the story of Iran to begin with power, with conquest, with the rise of a great ruler. But instead, it begins here, in quiet places, in small decisions repeated over generations, in the careful digging of a water channel, in the sharing of knowledge between strangers, in the silent observation of stars above an open land. These moments do not announce themselves as history. They do not feel important in the way we often imagine the past. But they are, because everything that comes later, every empire, every revolution, every transformation will carry traces of this beginning. You take one last look across the plateau. The land feels endless but no longer empty. It is full of movement, of life, of possibility waiting to unfold. And somewhere within it, unseen, for now the first steps toward Persia are already underway. The night begins to fall gently, the sky deepening into soft darkness. The fires in the settlement glow warmer, quieter. Voices fade into low murmurs. The world settles. And you remain there for a moment longer, standing at the very beginning of a story that will stretch across thousands of years, shaping not only a region but the identity of a nation that has never fully forgotten where it came from. You begin to notice a shift in the land around you. The scattered settlements you saw before are no longer as isolated. Paths between them feel more defined now, as if people are moving with greater purpose. Trade is becoming more regular. Communication, though still slow, carries a growing sense of direction, and within this quiet transformation a name begins to emerge. Cyrus. You do not meet him all at once, instead you hear of him first. In conversations spoken beside fires, in the cautious tone of travellers who have seen something changing far to the southwest. They describe a leader unlike others, not just a conqueror, but a unifier. A widely accepted historical account tells us that Cyrus the Great rose in the 6th century BCE and began to unite various Persian tribes under a single rule. What makes this moment feel different is not only the expansion of power, but the method behind it. You walk into a larger settlement now, one that feels more organised. There is a sense of structure that was not present before. Officials move with intention. Messages are carried carefully. There is an awareness that decisions made here will affect places far beyond what you can see. You begin to understand that this is no longer just a collection of communities. It is becoming something else. An empire in its earliest form. A lesser-known detail is that Cyrus did not rely solely on force to expand his influence. In many cases, he allowed conquered peoples to maintain their own customs, religions, and local leaders. This approach was unusual for its time. Instead of erasing identities, he absorbed them. You can almost feel the effect of this policy as you move through the area. There are different languages being spoken, different clothing styles, different traditions all existing side by side without immediate conflict. It creates a kind of quiet stability. You imagine what it must have felt like for those living under this new rule. Not the chaos of destruction, but the uncertainty of change that does not immediately threaten their way of life. Some researchers suggest that this strategy of tolerance was not purely idealistic, but deeply practical. By allowing diversity to remain, Cyrus reduced resistance and strengthened loyalty across vast territories. As you observe the growing network around you, this interpretation begins to make sense. You follow a group of travellers arriving from a distant region. They carry goods you have not seen before, textiles with unfamiliar patterns, tools shaped differently. They are welcomed not as outsiders, but as part of a larger system that is slowly connecting the known world. The air feels different now, not heavier, but more purposeful. You hear discussions about distant lands that are now under the same rule. Regions that once had no connection, now linked through a shared authority. The idea feels almost impossible when you remember how fragmented everything once seemed. And yet here it is taking shape. Scholars remain divided about the exact motivations behind Cyrus's expansion. Some view him as a visionary who believed in a unified and just system. Others argue that his actions were guided primarily by ambition, and the practical needs of power. As you stand within this emerging empire, both possibilities seem to coexist. You continue walking, eventually reaching a place where decisions are made. It is not yet the grand capital that will come later, but it carries the early signs of centralized rule. Records are being kept. Orders are issued and then carried outward across distances that would have once made coordination impossible. You notice something else, a sense of identity forming. Before, people identified mainly with their local communities. Now there is a broader awareness, a growing understanding that they are part of something larger than their immediate surroundings. Not everyone embraces it fully. Some remain cautious, others resist quietly, but the idea has begun to take hold. A kingdom called Persia. You pause as the sun begins to lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. The light softens, and for a moment, everything feels still again, but beneath that stillness there is movement, expansion, change that will not reverse. You think back to the earlier settlements, to the quiet independence of those small communities. That world has not disappeared, but it is being woven into something far more complex. You begin to sense the scale of what is happening. This is not just the rise of a ruler. It is the beginning of a system that will influence how empires function for centuries to come. You walk along a newly established route, one that feels more deliberate than the paths you saw before. It connects one settlement to another with a clarity of purpose. You imagine similar routes stretching outward, linking regions across mountains and deserts. The land that once felt vast and disconnected is slowly becoming organized, and with that organization comes power. Seek power. Not only military power, but administrative power, cultural power, the ability to shape how people live, communicate, and understand their place in the world. You hear a story whispered among travelers. It speaks of how Cyrus entered the city of Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. A detail often mentioned in historical accounts. He is said to have allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands, restoring temples and traditions that had been suppressed. Whether every part of this story is entirely accurate is something historians still examine carefully, but the impact of the narrative itself is undeniable. It shapes how people see him, not just as a king, but as something more enduring, a symbol of a different kind of rule. The sky darkens slowly now, and the first stars begin to appear. You notice them again, just as you did earlier in the story, but this time the world beneath them feels different. More connected, more aware of itself. You realize that what you're witnessing is not only the rise of Persia, but the beginning of a pattern, a way of governing that balances control with flexibility, power with adaptation. This pattern will not remain unchanged. It will be challenged, reshaped, and at times broken, but its influence will linger. You take a slow breath, letting the cool evening air settle around you. The sounds of the settlement soften into the background, conversations fade, movement slows, and yet even as night arrives, the empire continues to grow, quietly, steadily, carried forward by decisions made in places like this, by people who may not fully realize the scale of what they are part of. You stand at the edge of this moment, watching as Persia begins to take its first true form. And somewhere ahead, beyond what you can see, its legacy is already beginning to stretch into the future. You continue forward, and the world around you expands in ways that feel almost difficult to comprehend. What once seemed like a growing kingdom now reveals itself as something far larger. The paths you followed have multiplied into a vast network. The settlements you pass through are no longer isolated points, but connected parts of a system that stretches across deserts, mountains, and distant rivers. You begin to understand that Persia has become more than an empire. It has become the first true superpower of its time. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus and expanded by his successors, grew to control one of the largest territories the world had ever seen, reaching from parts of India to Egypt and even into southeastern Europe. As you stand within this immense landscape, the scale feels almost unreal. You imagine the diversity contained within it. Different climates, different languages, different traditions, all existing under a single political structure. It is not uniform, it is not simple, but somehow it functions. You walk through a city that feels more developed than any you have seen before. The streets are wider, The buildings more deliberate. There is a rhythm to the movement of people that suggests coordination rather than chance. Officials move with purpose, carrying tablets or scrolls. Messengers arrive and depart with urgency. There is an underlying order that holds everything together. You begin to notice something else. The presence of governance. A lesser-known detail is that the empire was divided into provinces known as satrapies, each overseen by a governor called a satrap. These satraps were responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining order and reporting back to the central authority. It was a system that allowed control over vast distances without requiring constant direct oversight. You picture these satraps spread across the empire, each managing their own region, while still connected to a greater whole. It is a delicate balance. Too much independence could lead to rebellion. Too much control could create resistance. And yet the system holds. You pass by a gathering where people from different regions are interacting. Their clothing, their speech, even their gestures reveal their varied origins. And still they communicate, trade, negotiate. It feels like a meeting point of worlds. Some researchers question whether the stability of such a vast empire was truly as strong as it appears, or if it relied heavily on the personal authority of its rulers. As you observe the structure around you, you sense that both may be true. Systems can endure, but leadership still shapes their strength. You continue walking, eventually reaching a place where authority is more visible. Guards stand at entrances, symbols of power are displayed not in an overwhelming way but with quiet confidence. You sense that this is where decisions ripple outward. The idea of kingship here feels different from what you might expect. It is not only about dominance, it carries a sense of responsibility, at least in how it is presented. The ruler is seen as a protector of order and maintainer of balance across a vast and varied world. You recall earlier moments in the story when small communities survived through shared knowledge and adaptation. Now that same principle seems to exist on a much larger scale. Instead of a village maintaining balance, it is an empire. You move through a marketplace filled with goods from distant lands, spices you cannot immediately recognize, metals shaped into tools and ornaments, fabrics dyed in colors that hint at faraway places. Each item tells a story of connection. You realize that this empire does not just control land. It facilitates movement, exchange, the blending of cultures in ways that would not have been possible before. There is also a quiet presence of law, rules that apply across regions, creating a sense of predictability. You see disputes being settled not through immediate conflict, but through structured processes. It is not perfect, it cannot be given the scale, but it represents something new. A system that attempts to bring order to complexity. Archaeologists continue discussing whether the administrative sophistication of Persia was entirely original or influenced by earlier civilizations such as Mesopotamia. As you observe the structures around you, it feels less like a single invention and more like a refinement, a gathering of ideas shaped into something more expansive. The sun moves slowly across the sky, and with it the rhythm of the city shifts. Morning activity gives way to a calmer afternoon. People rest, conversations soften. The intensity of movement fades slightly but never completely. Because the empire does not pause, you find yourself drawn toward a vantage point overlooking the city. From here you can see how everything connects. Roads leading in multiple directions. Caravans arriving and departing. Buildings arranged with intention rather than randomness. It feels like looking at a living organism, each part functioning on its own yet dependent on the whole. You think about the challenge of maintaining such a system, the distances involved, the time it takes for messages to travel, the potential for misunderstanding, for conflict, for fragmentation. And yet for now it works. There is a quiet confidence in the way people move, as if they trust the structure around them. Not blindly, but enough to rely on it in their daily lives. You notice a group of workers recording information carefully. Numbers, goods, transactions. It may seem small, but it represents something essential. Control through knowledge, understanding what exists, where it moves, how it is used. You begin to see how power here is not only about armies or territory, it is about information, organization, the ability to manage complexity without losing coherence. The sky begins to soften again as evening approaches. Light fades gently, casting a calm tone over the city. The sounds become quieter, more measured. You take a moment to reflect on how far the story has already come, from scattered settlements on a wide plateau to a structured empire that connects continents, from survival based on local knowledge to governance that spans cultures. And still, this is only the beginning, because the systems you see here will influence future empires, shaping how power is organized for generations to come. Even those who oppose Persia will learn from it, adapt its methods, and carry its ideas forward. You stand there watching as the last light of day settles over the land. The empire breathes steadily around you. Not rushed, not chaotic, but vast, deliberate, and quietly powerful. And somewhere within that quiet power, the foundations of modern Iran are being laid layer by layer, in ways that will not fully reveal themselves until much later. You step onto a road that feels different from any path you have walked before. It is wider, more deliberate, carefully maintained. The ground beneath your feet is firm, packed down by countless travellers who have passed this way before you. There are markers placed at intervals, subtle but intentional, guiding movement across distances that would otherwise feel endless. This is not just a road. It is a system. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Persians developed an extensive network of routes, the most famous being the Royal Road, which stretched over 2,500 kilometres, connecting the heart of the empire to its distant edges. It allowed communication and travel on a scale that had rarely been achieved before. You begin to follow it. At first, the journey feels simple. The landscape opens around you, revealing plains that stretch into the distance. The air carries a quiet stillness, broken only by the occasional movement of travellers heading in both directions. But as you continue, you notice something remarkable. The road is alive with purpose. Messengers move quickly, their pace steady and focused. Caravans transport goods from one region to another. Officials travel with guarded intent, carrying orders that will shape decisions far away from where they were written. You realise that this road is not just about movement, it is about connection. A lesser-known detail is that along this road the Persians established relay stations where fresh horses and supplies were kept ready for royal messengers. This system allowed information to travel with surprising speed, far faster than any ordinary traveller could manage. You pause near one of these stations. It is modest in appearance but efficient. Horses are cared for with precision. Supplies are organised carefully. People move with quiet urgency, understanding the importance of what passes through here. You watch as a messenger arrives, dust settling around him. Without hesitation, he dismounts, hands off his message, and another rider takes his place, continuing the journey almost immediately. The transition is seamless. You can feel the significance of it. Messages do not wait. Decisions do not pause. The empire stays connected through this constant flow. Some historians suggest that this communication system was one of the key reasons the Persian Empire could maintain control over such vast territories. Without it, coordination would have broken down. Authority would have weakened. The empire might have fractured much earlier. As you continue along the road, you begin to see how it shapes everything around it. Settlements grow near its path. Trade becomes more predictable. Cultural exchange increases. Ideas travel alongside goods carried by those who move between regions. You pass by a group of travellers speaking a language you do not fully understand. Yet their presence here feels natural. The road allows for difference without isolation. It creates a shared Persian space. You think back to earlier moments when communities were connected only by occasional contact. Now connection is constant, structured, expected. The scale of it begins to settle in your mind. This is not just infrastructure, it's control over distance itself. Archaeologists continue discussing whether the full extent of the Royal Road and its supporting network has been completely understood, as some sections may have extended even further than currently documented. As you walk, the road seems endless, reinforcing that sense of uncertainty. You reach a higher point in the landscape where the road curves gently and reveals a view of the terrain ahead. Mountains rise faintly in the distance. The path continues toward them unwavering. You imagine how many journeys have taken place here. Merchants carrying goods that will change local economies, officials enforcing policies that shape entire regions, messengers delivering news that can shift the course of history. Each step on this road carries weight, and yet for those walking it daily, it is simply part of life. You notice how the road is maintained. Workers repair sections where the surface has worn down. Markers are adjusted. There is an ongoing effort to preserve its function. This is not a one-time creation. It is a living system that requires attention. You begin to understand that the strength of the empire lies not only in its size or its rulers, but in these quieter structures that support everything else. Without the road, the empire would feel distant from itself. With it, the empire becomes immediate. You pass another station as the day moves forward. The activity there mirrors what you saw before, but each location has its own subtle differences shaped by the surrounding region, and still they are connected by the same purpose. Consistency across distance. Scholars remain divided about how much of this system was centrally planned from the beginning versus developed gradually over time. As you observe its complexity, it feels likely that it evolved adapting to the needs of the empire as it expanded. The sun begins to lower again, casting a softer light across the road. Shadows stretch and the pace of travel slows slightly, though it never fully stops. Because somewhere at every moment someone is moving. You step aside for a passing group, watching as they continue without hesitation. Their journey is part of something larger, even if they do not fully see it. You take a moment to stand still, to feel the road beneath you, to sense the quiet power of connection that runs through it. Earlier, when you stood in isolated settlements, distance felt like a barrier. Now it feels like something that has been carefully managed, reduced and reshaped. The world has become smaller, not in size but in accessibility. You begin to see how this will influence everything that follows. Empires to come will build roads of their own, systems of communication, networks that allow control to extend beyond immediate reach. But here you are, witnessing one of the earliest and most effective versions of that idea. The sky deepens into evening once more. The colours soften, blending into calm tones that settle over the land. The road continues into the fading light, its path still clear, still purposeful. You take one last look along its length, and you realise that this road does more than connect places. It connects time. Because the ideas carried along it, the methods it represents, will travel far beyond the Persian Empire itself. They will move forward into the future, shaping how civilizations organize, communicate, and understand the world. You turn gently, letting the quiet rhythm of the road fade behind you. But its presence remains. Steady, enduring, a silent thread holding an empire together. You move away from the road, leaving behind the steady rhythm of travel, and enter a quieter space. The land feels different here, less defined by movement, more shaped by stillness. The air carries a faint scent of ash and something warmer, almost comforting. As you walk, you begin to notice small structures set apart from ordinary dwellings. They are simple yet treated with a kind of quiet respect. Inside one of them, a flame burns. It does not flicker wildly, it moves gently, steady and controlled, as if it is being watched not only for warmth but for meaning. You step closer, lowering your voice without quite knowing why. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that Zoroastrianism was one of the earliest organized belief systems in this region, shaping the spiritual life of the Persian Empire long before the arrival of later religions. At its center is a powerful idea that the world is a balance between opposing forces, light and darkness, truth and falsehood, order and chaos. You watch as someone tends to the fire, carefully adding fuel with deliberate movements. The flame is not allowed to die, it is maintained, protected, respected. You begin to understand that this fire is more than physical. It represents something constant in a world that is always changing. A lesser-known detail is that Zoroastrian priests were responsible for maintaining sacred fires that could burn continuously for years, even decades. These flames were seen as symbols of divine presence and moral clarity, something that connected daily life to a larger cosmic order. You sit quietly, feeling the warmth against your skin. There is a calm here that feels different from the organized movement of the empire outside. This is not about control or expansion, it is about meaning. You listen as soft voices speak nearby, not loudly, but with intention. Words about good thoughts, good words and good deeds. Simple ideas, yet powerful in their clarities. You reflect on how these beliefs might shape the people who live within the empire. If the world is seen as a struggle between good and evil, then every action carries weight. Every choice becomes part of a larger story. Some researchers suggest that this moral framework influenced how Persian rulers presented themselves, not just as powerful figures, but as protectors of truth and order. As you think back to what you saw earlier, the structured governance, the emphasis on fairness and stability, this connection begins to feel more visible. You look again at the flame. It remains steady, unmoving in its purpose even as everything around it shifts. You begin to notice symbols carved into nearby surfaces, repeated shapes, patterns that seem to carry meaning beyond decoration. They are not random, they reflect a shared understanding of visual language tied to belief. Outside the world continues. People walk, trade, speak, live their daily lives. But here there is a pause, a space where the deeper questions are held. Why does order matter? What is the nature of truth? How should one live within a world that is not always balanced? Scholars remain divided about how widespread and uniform Zoroastrian practices were across the empire. Some believe it was a dominant and organized religion, while others argue that local variations and other beliefs continued alongside it. As you observe this quiet place, it feels likely that both existed together, much like the diversity you have already seen. You step outside again, the cool air brushing gently against your face. The contrast between the warmth of the fire and the openness of the land feels almost symbolic. Inside clarity, outside complexity, and yet both are part of the same world. You walk slowly through a nearby settlement, noticing how belief is woven into everyday life. Small gestures, quiet rituals, ways of speaking that reflect an awareness of something beyond the immediate moment. You see a parent teaching a child not only how to perform a task, but how to do it correctly, honestly. There is an emphasis not just on action, but on intention. You begin to understand that religion here is not separate from life. It shapes it, guides it, gives it direction. You think back to the early communities you visited where survival was the primary focus. Now, survival is still important, but it is accompanied by something else, a sense of purpose. A framework for understanding the world beyond immediate needs. You notice how the sky above begins to darken, the first stars appearing once more. You remember how people once observed them quietly without formal interpretation. Now those observations are connected to belief, to meaning, to a larger structure of thought. The world feels more defined, not simpler but more explained. You pause again, letting the quiet settle around you. There is something deeply human about this moment. The desire to understand not just how to live, but why. To create systems of belief that bring order to uncertainty. To hold on to something constant like the steady flame you saw earlier. You realize that this spiritual foundation will not disappear even as the empire changes. It will evolve, adapt, influence future beliefs in ways that may not always be visible but are always present. The wind moves softly across the land, carrying with it the faint scent of fire once more. You close your eyes for a brief moment, feeling the warmth you experienced earlier, even though you now stand outside. It lingers. Just as the ideas you have encountered here will linger, shaping the identity of this land long after the empire itself begins to change. You open your eyes again, looking out across the quiet settlement. Life continues, the flame burns, and somewhere within that steady light, the early soul of Iran begins to take form, not through power or conquest, but through belief. You move forward again, leaving behind the quiet glow of fire and belief and entering a world where tension slowly begins to build. At first it is subtle, a shift in conversation, a certain alertness in the way people speak about distant lands. Names begin to surface more often. Places across the sea. Cities that do not belong to this empire yet seem to occupy its thoughts. You hear one name repeated with particular weight. Greece! You travel westward. In your mind, imagine coastlines, islands scattered across deep blue water, communities that are smaller, more fragmented, yet fiercely independent. These are not lands that easily fold into a larger system. They resist. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Persian Empire came into conflict with Greek city-states during the 5th century BC, leading to a series of wars that would shape how both sides viewed each other for generations. As you stand between these two worlds, you begin to sense how different they are. On one side, a vast empire built on structure, connection, and diversity under a central authority. On the other, smaller city-states, each with its own identity, fiercely protective of its independence, valuing local control over unified rule. You feel the contrast. It is not just political, it is cultural. You walk through a Persian-controlled coastal region where ships move slowly in the distance. There is a sense of preparation here. Supplies are gathered, plans are discussed. Messengers arrive more frequently than before. Something is coming. A lesser-known detail is that many Greek cities in Asia Minor were already under Persian control, and it was a revolt in these regions known as the Ionian Revolt that helped spark the larger conflict between Persia and mainland Greece. You imagine the tension in those cities, caught between identities, part of the empire yet connected to the Greek world. Their rebellion is not just a local event, it becomes a signal, a shift that draws attention from both sides. You begin to understand how conflict can grow from places where cultures meet and overlap. Some researchers question whether the Persian campaigns against Greece were driven purely by expansion or if they were also a response to instability along the empire's edges. As you observe the situation, it feels less like a single cause and more like a chain of reactions, each decision leading to the next. You move closer to the preparation. You see soldiers not in chaotic movement but in organized formations. Equipment is checked carefully, orders are given clearly. There is discipline, but also an awareness that what lies ahead is uncertain. You sense that this is not just another expansion. This is different. The Greeks do not respond like other regions. They do not simply become part of the system. They push back. You hear stories begin to circulate of battles fought near a place called Marathon, of a small Greek force facing a much larger Persian army. The details vary depending on who tells them. Some emphasize Persian strength, others focus on Greek resistance. Historians still debate the exact numbers and strategies involved, as ancient sources often exaggerate or conflict with one another, but the significance of the event is clear. It becomes a symbol. You imagine the battlefield, the tension before movement, the sound of footsteps across open ground, the moment when two very different worlds collide. You feel the weight of that collision, not just in terms of victory or defeat, but in how it shapes perception. The Greeks begin to see themselves as defenders of freedom against a powerful empire. The Persians see a region that resists integration, one that requires more attention, more effort. The conflict continues. You hear of another place, Thermopylae, a narrow pass where geography itself becomes part of the battle. Again, the story is layered with meaning, courage, resistance, strategy shaped by landscape. And yet, as with many moments in history, the full truth remains complex. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of the popular narrative surrounding these battles has been shaped by later storytelling, particularly from Greek perspectives that emphasized heroism and resistance. You begin to realize that history is not only about what happens, but how it is remembered. You move through a Persian camp at dusk. The atmosphere is quieter now, fires burn low, conversations are more subdued. There is a sense of reflection, of reassessment. The empire remains vast, powerful, organized, but it has encountered something unexpected, a different way of thinking, a different structure of society, one that cannot be easily absorbed. You sit for a moment watching the flicker of light against armor and fabric. You think back to the earlier sections of your journey, the formation of the empire, the systems that hold it together, the beliefs that give it meaning, and now you see it meeting resistance that is not easily resolved. You begin to understand that this moment will echo far into the future, because these conflicts will shape how the West and East see each other. They will influence stories, identities, even assumptions about power and culture that last for centuries. The sky darkens slowly above you, the stars returning once more. You notice how despite the tension, the world still follows its quiet rhythm. The wind moves gently. The fire continues to burn. Life does not stop. And yet something has changed. A line has been drawn not just across land but across perception. You stand between these worlds, feeling the distance between them even as they come into contact. And you realize that the story of Persia is no longer only about expansion. It is also about encounter, about difference, about the challenge of understanding a world that does not mirror your own. You take a slow breath, letting the quiet of the night settle around you. The conflict is not over. In many ways, it has only begun. You move forward into a moment where the rhythm of the empire begins to falter. At first, it is not obvious. The structures you have seen still stand, the roads continue to carry travelers, the systems of governance still function. On the surface, everything appears as it always has. But beneath that surface, something's shifting. You begin to hear a new name spoken quietly at first, then with increasing urgency. Alexander. You imagine him not as a distant legend, but as a presence moving steadily toward the heart of the empire. A young ruler from the kingdom of Macedon far to the west, carrying with him an ambition that feels both focused and unpredictable. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that Alexander the Great launched his campaign against the Persian Empire in the 4th century BCE, defeating Persian forces in a series of decisive battles that would ultimately bring an end to Achaemenid rule. You stand within Persia as the news spreads. It does not arrive all at once, it moves along the same networks you have already walked. Roads carry not only goods and message, but also reports of defeat. You hear of a battle near a river, then another. Each time the details are slightly different, shaped by distance and perspective. But the pattern is clear. The empire is losing ground. You begin to feel a tension that was not present before. Not the steady preparation of earlier conflicts, but something more uncertain. A sense that the systems which once ensured stability are now being tested in ways they were not designed to withstand. A lesser known detail is that some regions within the Persian Empire surrendered to Alexander without significant resistance, either out of fear, strategic calculation, or dissatisfaction with existing leadership. This suggests that the unity of the empire, while impressive, may not have been as solid everywhere as it appeared. You walk through a city where officials speak in lower tones now. Their movements are still organized, but there is hesitation. Decisions carry more weight because the future feels less predictable. You see soldiers preparing again, but this time the confidence feels different, more cautious, more aware of what has already been lost. Some researchers question whether the rapid success of Alexander was due more to his military brilliance or to internal weaknesses within the Persian Empire. As you observe the situation, it feels like a combination of both. An external force pushing inward, an internal structure beginning to strain. You imagine the great confrontation, the Battle of Gaugamela, a vast open space where two very different forces meet. On one side, the established might of Persia. On the other, a smaller but highly disciplined army led by a commander who adapts quickly, thinks strategically, and moves with precision. You feel the weight of that moment, the dust rising, the tension before movement, the realization that everything built over generations is now at risk. Historians still debate the exact decisions made during the battle, particularly those of the Persian king Darius III. Some suggest that strategic errors played a crucial role in the outcome. Others argue that Alexander's tactics simply overwhelmed the Persian forces regardless of their choices. As the battle unfolds in your mind, the result becomes clear. Persia falls, not instantly, not everywhere at once, but in a way that cannot be reversed. You walk through spaces that once felt stable, now carrying a different atmosphere. The authority that held everything together has weakened. Orders are no longer followed with the same certainty. Loyalty begins to shift. You notice how quickly change can move once it begins. Cities that once looked inward toward the Persian center now look outward, adjusting to a new reality. Some resist, others adapt, many simply try to survive. You pass by a group of people speaking about the arrival of Alexander in one of the great cities. They describe him not only as a conqueror, but as someone who adopts certain Persian customs, presenting himself in ways that are meant to be accepted by those he now rules. This detail feels important, because it suggests that even in conquest there is adaptation. Archaeologists continue discussing the extent to which Alexander intentionally integrated Persian traditions into his rule. or whether these actions were more symbolic than structural. As you reflect on this, it seems likely that his approach was both practical and strategic, much like what you saw earlier with Cyrus. You pause near the remains of a place that once symbolized Persian power. The structure still stands, but its meaning has shifted. It is no longer the center of an empire. It is part of a memory. You feel a quiet sense of transition, not abrupt, but undeniable. The empire that once connected vast lands that built roads, systems, and shared identity has been overtaken by something new. And yet it has not disappeared entirely. You begin to notice traces of continuity, the language still spoken, the customs still practiced, the underlying structures that do not vanish simply because leadership changes. You think back to the earliest moments of your journey, the small settlements, the gradual formation of identity, and you realize that while empires can fall, the deeper layers of a civilization endure. The sky above you fades into evening once more. The same sky that has watched every stage of this story, from the quiet beginnings to the rise of power, and now to its transformation. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness return. There is no dramatic ending here, no sudden silence. Instead, there is a quiet shift, a turning of direction. You stand at the edge of one era and the beginning of another. And as you look ahead, you sense that Persia's story is not over. It is simply changing form. You continue forward expecting the world to feel entirely different after the fall of Persia, but instead, what you find is something more subtle. Change has arrived, yes, but it's not erased what came before. It has layered itself over it, blending, reshaping, and slowly creating something new. You walk through a city that feels familiar yet slightly altered. The architecture carries echoes of Persian design, but there are new elements now. Columns shaped in a different style, decorations that reflect influences from the West. The language around you shifts as well. You hear Greek spoken alongside local tongues, not replacing them but existing beside them. A widely accepted historical understanding tells us that after the conquests of Alexander the Great, much of the former Persian Empire entered a period known as the Hellenistic Age, where Greek culture spread across vast territories, blending with local traditions. You begin to feel that blending in real time. Markets carry goods that reflect both worlds. Artistic styles merge, creating forms that feel neither entirely Persian nor entirely Greek. Even the way people carry themselves seems to shift, influenced by new ideas about identity and expression. You move slowly through this environment, noticing how change does not happen all at once. It settles, adapts, finds its place within what already exists. A lesser-known detail is that many Greek rulers who succeeded Alexander, particularly the Seleucids, actively encouraged the founding of new cities that followed Greek models, while still relying on existing Persian administrative systems to maintain control. You imagine the complexity of that approach. New cities rising designed with Greek layouts, older cities continuing with their established rhythms, both connected under a shared political structure that is still trying to define itself. You pass through a gathering space where people discuss ideas, philosophy, science, governance. The tone feels different from earlier sections of your journey. There is more open debate, more questioning, more emphasis on individual thought, and yet the deeper cultural memory of Persia remains present. Some researchers suggest that this period of blending was not entirely smooth, and that tensions existed between those who embraced Greek influence and those who wished to preserve traditional Persian identity. As you observe the environment around you, you sense both acceptance and resistance existing side by side. You pause near a structure that appears to serve as a center of learning. Inside, scrolls are studied carefully. Knowledge is being collected, translated, shared. Ideas travel more freely now, crossing cultural boundaries in ways that were once limited. You begin to see how this moment contributes to something larger, not just the continuation of Persian identity, but its transformation. You think back to the systems of governance you saw earlier, the satrapies, the roads, the methods of managing a vast empire. Those systems have not disappeared. They have been adapted, incorporated into new frameworks that allow the Hellenistic rulers to maintain control. It is as if Persia continues to exist beneath the surface, quietly supporting what has replaced it. Archaeologists continue discussing how deeply Greek cultural influence penetrated everyday life in these regions. as much of what survives comes from elite or urban contexts rather than the daily experiences of ordinary people. As you walk through quieter areas, you begin to wonder how much has truly changed for those living outside the centres of power. You notice familiar patterns in how people farm, how they build their homes, how they organise their daily routines. These elements feel continuous, steady, less affected by political shifts than one might expect. You move toward the edge of the city where the landscape opens once again. The mountains in the distance remain unchanged. The wind still carries the same quiet presence. Nature does not adjust to empire, it remains constant. You reflect on how this stability in the environment may help preserve cultural identity, even as political control changes. You remember the early settlements, the shared knowledge, the slow formation of identity tied to the land. That connection has not been broken. It has simply been layered with new influences. You hear music in the distance. It carries tones that feel both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Instruments you recognize are played in new ways. Rhythms blend, creating something that did not exist before. This is what blending looks like. Not replacement, not disappearance, but transformation. Scholars remain divided about whether this period should be seen as a loss of Persian identity or as an expansion of it through interaction with Greek culture. As you stand within it, the answer feels more nuanced than either perspective alone. You continue walking as the light begins to fade once more. The city settles into evening. People return to their homes. Conversations soften. The sense of transition becomes quieter, less visible. But it is still there. You realize that this period, often seen as an interruption, is actually part of a longer continuity, because the ideas, systems, and cultural foundations of Persia are not erased. They are carried forward, adapted, reinterpreted, and in some ways strengthened through interaction. You take a slow breath, letting the calm of the evening settle around you. The world has changed, but it has not lost itself. You look out across the land, feeling the layers of history beneath your feet, and you begin to understand that the story of Persia is not defined only by its rise or fall. It is defined by its ability to endure, even when transformed, even when reshaped by forces beyond its control. The night deepens gently and the blended world around you becomes quieter still. But beneath that quiet, something continues to grow. A new form of identity, one that carries both memory and change. You move forward again, and with time, the blended world you have been observing begins to shift once more. The Greek influence that once felt dominant starts to soften at the edges, not disappearing entirely but losing its central hold. In its place, something older begins to rise again, something that feels more deeply rooted in the land itself. You sense it before you fully understand it. A return. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Parthian Empire emerged in the 3rd century BCE, gradually reclaiming much of the territory once held by the Achaemenids and establishing a new Iranian power that would challenge even the might of Rome. You walk into a landscape that feels both familiar and newly defined. The structures of governance are less rigidly centralized than before. Authority is shared among powerful families and regional leaders. There is a flexibility here that contrasts with the tightly organized systems of earlier Persia, and yet it works. In its own way, you begin to notice how identity is shifting again. The Greek elements that once stood out so clearly are now integrated, absorbed into a broader cultural framework that feels increasingly Iranian. Language begins to lean more toward local forms. Customs that had adapted begin to return to older patterns. It's not a rejection of what came before, but a rebalancing. A lesser-known detail is that the Parthians were known for their unique style of warfare, particularly their use of highly skilled horse archers who could shoot accurately while retreating, a tactic that would later become famously known as the Parthian shot. You imagine the movement of these riders across open land. Fast, precise, difficult to predict. It reflects something about the empire itself. Less rigid. More fluid. You move through a settlement where authority feels more dispersed. There is no single, overwhelming center of power. Instead, influence is distributed, negotiated, maintained through relationships rather than strict control. You sense both strength and vulnerability in this structure. Some researchers suggest that this decentralized system allowed the Parthians to adapt more easily to different regions and challenges. Others question whether it also made the empire more prone to internal conflict and instability. As you observe the balance, it feels delicate, effective but not without tension. You continue walking and soon another presence begins to emerge on the horizon. Rome. You do not see it directly at first. You feel it in the conversations, in the increased movement of soldiers, in the attention given to the western edges of the empire. Two powers, two systems, both expanding, both unwilling to yield. You begin to understand that the world is no longer defined by a single dominant empire. It is now shaped by soul rivalry. You move closer to the frontier where the atmosphere is different, more alert, more uncertain. There are fortifications here, but they are not overwhelming. The landscape itself plays a role in defense. Distance, terrain, and mobility all become part of the strategy. You imagine encounters between Parthian and Roman forces, not always large-scale battles, but ongoing confrontations, skirmishes, strategic maneuvers, attempts to outthink as much as outfight. Historians still debate the exact balance of power between Rome and Parthia, as both sides recorded their victories more prominently than their defeats. As you consider this, it becomes clear that perception is as important as reality in shaping historical narratives. You hear of a battle, Carrhae, a place where Roman forces confident and experienced are met by something they did not fully expect. The mobility of Parthian cavalry, the precision of mounted archers, the difficulty of fighting an enemy that does not engage in the way you anticipate. The outcome is decisive, and it shifts the understanding of power. You feel the significance of that moment, not just as a victory, but as a statement that this land, this evolving Iranian identity, is not simply a continuation of past empires. It is something capable of standing on its own. You walk through a camp at dusk where soldiers rest and prepare. The mood is not celebratory but steady, focused. They understand that this is not the end of conflict. It's part of an ongoing balance. You sit quietly listening to the low sounds of conversation, the soft movements of people settling into the evening. You think back to the earlier empires, the centralized control of the Achaemenids, the blending of cultures under Hellenistic rule. Now you see a different model, one that relies on movement, on adaptability, on a balance between unity and independence. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of Parthian culture has been lost or remains poorly understood due to fewer surviving records compared to earlier Persian empires. As you look around, you feel that absence, a sense that much of this world exists just beyond clear visibility, and yet its impact is real. You notice how Persian identity continues to evolve here, not as a fixed concept, but as something living, shaped by interaction, strengthened by challenge, carried forward through both continuity and change. The sky above deepens once more, the stars returning in their familiar patterns. You feel a quiet sense of recognition. No matter how much changes, some elements remain constant. The land, the sky, the underlying rhythm of life. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle around you. The rivalry between Rome and Parthia will continue for generations, shaping borders, influencing politics, and defining the patterns of power in this region. But beyond the conflict, something else is happening. A deeper identity is taking form, not tied to a single ruler, not dependent on a single system, but rooted in the land and carried through time. You stand at the edge of this moment, watching as Persia, now transformed into something new, continues to assert itself in a changing world, and you begin to sense that its story is far from finished. You continue along the shifting edge of empires where the land itself seems to hold its breath. To the west, Rome expands with steady determination. To the east, the Parthian world adapts, resists, and endures. Between them lies a frontier that is never fully settled, always changing, always watched. You step into this space of tension. It does not feel like a single battlefield. It feels like a long-stretched line across deserts, rivers, and mountain passes where influence moves back and forth over time. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the rivalry between the Roman Empire and the Parthian Empire lasted for centuries, shaping the political landscape of the ancient world and creating one of history's most enduring geopolitical balances. You walk through a fortified settlement near this frontier. The structures are practical rather than grand. Walls built for defense, watchtowers placed with clear purpose, soldiers move through the area not hurried but alert. This is not a place of constant battle. It is a place of readiness. You notice how the people here live with a different awareness. Conversations carry an undercurrent of caution. News from distant regions matters more because it may signal change along the border. You imagine how it feels to live in a place where the line between peace and conflict is never entirely stable. A lesser-known detail is that diplomacy between Rome and Parthia was just as important as warfare. Envoys travelled between the two empires, negotiating treaties, arranging exchanges, and sometimes preventing conflicts that could have escalated into larger wars. You picture these envoys moving carefully, aware that their words carry weight equal to armies. You begin to understand that power here is not only measured in battles, it is in restraint and in decisions not to fight, in agreements that hold even if only for a time. You walk further, following a route that leads toward a river marking part of the boundary between these worlds. The water flows steadily, indifferent to the tension it represents. On one side, Roman influence, on the other, Parthian control, and yet the boundary is not absolute. Trade still occurs, ideas still pass through, people cross sometimes officially, sometimes quietly. Some researchers suggest that this constant interaction created a form of cultural exchange that is often overlooked, as the focus tends to remain on conflict rather than connection. As you observe the movement across the frontier, this idea begins to feel very real. You see merchants negotiating in multiple languages. You hear stories shared between travelers who have experienced both worlds. There is difference, yes, but also familiarity. You pause near a group discussing a recent encounter, a Roman advance, a Parthian response. The details are complex, shaped by perspective, but the pattern remains consistent. Neither side fully overcomes the other. Instead, they adapt, they learn, they adjust their strategies over time. Historians still debate whether either empire could have decisively defeated the other under different circumstances, or if the balance of power was inherently stable due to geography, logistics, and the internal challenges each faced. As you stand here, the idea of balance feels more convincing than the idea of total victory. You move towards a temporary camp where soldiers prepare for possible engagement. Their equipment reflects their environment. Roman soldiers rely on structured formations, heavy armor, discipline that emphasizes unity. Parthian forces move more fluidly, relying on speed, distance, and precision. Two different approaches to the same reality. You imagine how these differences play out in battle. The clash is not just physical, it is conceptual. Order against adaptability, structure against movement, and yet over time each begins to learn from the other. Roman forces adapt to counter-mounted archers. Parthian strategies evolve in response to Roman discipline. This is not a static conflict. It is a continuous process of adjustment. Archaeologists continue discussing how much direct influence these interactions had on military development in both empires, as evidence suggests a gradual exchange of tactics rather than complete separation. You step back from the camp as evening begins to settle. The tension softens slightly, replaced by the quiet routines of rest. Fires are lit. Meals are prepared. Conversations become more personal, less focused on strategy. You realize it's even in places defined by conflict, life continues in familiar ways. People still eat, still speak, still find moments of calm. You sit for a moment watching the light of the fires flicker against the darkening sky. You think about how this long rivalry shapes not only borders but identity. The Iranian world, evolving through Parthian rule, defines itself partly in contrast to Rome, and Rome in turn sees the East through the lens of this ongoing struggle. You begin to see how these perceptions will echo into the future, how ideas about East and West, about difference and opposition, will be carried forward long after these empires themselves have changed. The stars begin to appear again, steady and familiar. You feel a sense of continuity. No matter how intense the rivalry, the world remains connected. The frontier is not just a line of division, it is also a space of interaction. of exchange, of understanding that grows quietly beneath the surface of conflict. You take a slow breath, letting the calm of the night settle around you. The balance between Rome and Parthia continues shaping the course of history in ways that are both visible and subtle. And as you stand there between two great powers, you begin to understand that this balance will not last forever. Because change, as you have already seen, is always approaching. You move forward in time, and once again the balance begins to shift. The Parthian world you have been observing, with its fluid power and adaptable structure, starts to feel less stable. Not collapsing suddenly, but weakening slowly, as if the threads holding it together are beginning to loosen. You sense it in the way authority is questioned, in the way regional leaders act with greater independence, in the quiet uncertainty that settles over the land. And then something new rises from within. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Sasanian Empire emerged in the 3rd century CE, overthrowing the Parthians and establishing a new Persian dynasty that sought to restore centralized power and revive elements of earlier imperial identity. You walk into this moment of transition. It does not feel chaotic. It feels deliberate. A movement led by a figure determined to reshape the structure of power itself. You hear the name Ardashir I spoken with growing recognition, a leader from the region of Persis who challenges the existing order and gradually builds support for a new vision. You imagine his rise, not as a sudden event, but as a series of calculated steps, building alliances, confronting rivals, expanding influence until the old system can no longer hold. A lesser-known detail is that the Sasanians actively sought to link themselves to the earlier Achaemenid Empire, presenting their rule as a restoration of true Persian greatness rather than simply a new dynasty. You begin to see how powerful that idea is. It connects the present to a distant past. It creates continuity. It gives legitimacy. You walk through a city that reflects this renewed sense of identity. The architecture feels more intentional, more symbolic. There is an emphasis on grandeur, on visual representation of authority. Relief carvings depict rulers with confidence and control, reinforcing the idea of a strong central power. You notice how governance begins to change. Authority is no longer as dispersed as it was under the Parthians. It is drawn inward, organized, structured. You see officials who represent the central authority more directly. Systems are refined, adjusted to ensure that control extends more consistently across the empire. Some researchers suggest that this shift towards centralization was necessary to strengthen the empire against external threats, particularly from Rome. Others question whether it also created new internal pressures by reducing the flexibility that had once allowed the Parthians to adapt more easily. As you observe the changes, both perspectives feel present, strength and tension growing together. You continue walking, and soon you begin to notice a renewed emphasis on tradition. Symbols that echo earlier Persian identity. Practices that reconnect with older cultural patterns. It feels like a conscious effort to remember, to reclaim, to define what it means to be Persian once again. You pass by a gathering where stories of the past are spoken with pride. The Achaemenids, the early empires, the achievements that shaped the land. These are not distant memories anymore. They are part of the present narrative. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of this connection to earlier Persia was based on accurate historical continuity versus symbolic reconstruction designed to strengthen Sasanian authority. As you listen to the stories being shared, it feels like both elements are intertwined. You move toward a place of power, a court where decisions are made. The atmosphere here is different from what you saw under Parthian rule, more formal, more structured. There is a clear hierarchy, a sense of order that defines interactions. You observe how the ruler is presented, not only as a political leader, but as a figure with a deeper connection to the order of the world itself. This connection is not accidental. It reflects a broader effort to align power with meaning. You think back to the religious foundations you encountered earlier, the ideas of order and truth. They seem to return here, woven into the identity of the state itself. You begin to see how governance and belief are becoming more closely linked. Not separate systems, but parts of a single structure. You step outside the court as the day begins to soften into evening. The city around you reflects this renewed energy. There is movement, but it feels more directed, more unified. You notice how people carry themselves with a sense of belonging to something defined, not just a region, not just a loose network, but a clearly shaped empire. You pause, reflecting on how this moment mirrors earlier stages of your journey. The rise of Cyrus, the formation of centralized power, and now a return to that idea reshaped by everything that has happened since. Scholars remain divided about whether the Sasanian Empire should be seen as a continuation of ancient Persian traditions or as a distinct entity that reinterpreted those traditions for its own purposes. As you stand within it, the distinction feels less important than the result. A renewed sense of identity, a strengthened structure of power, a reassertion of what Persia means. The sky darkens slowly above you. The familiar rhythm of evening returns, and with it a sense of calm that contrasts with the transformation you have just witnessed. You take a slow breath, letting the stillness settle. The empire stands once again not as it was before, but as something shaped by memory and change. And you begin to sense that this revival will carry Persia forward into one of its most defining eras. You step deeper into its renewed empire, and the sense of order becomes more visible with every movement. The world around you feels structured in a way that is both deliberate and refined. It is no longer only about reclaiming power. It is about shaping how that power is experienced, seen and understood. You walk through a city that feels alive with ceremony. The streets are wide and carefully arranged. Buildings rise with symmetry and intention. There is a balance between function and display, between daily life and something more elevated. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Sasanian court became one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, known for its elaborate rituals, strict hierarchy and cultural refinement that influenced neighbouring regions. You begin to sense this sophistication not just in grand spaces, but in small details. The way people greet one another, the way officials stand, speak and move. There is an awareness of position, of status, of role within a larger system. You approach a gathering near the royal court. It is not chaotic, it's carefully arranged. Each person knows where they belong, where they should stand, how they should behave. The structure is not imposed loudly, it is understood. You notice how the ruler is positioned at the centre of this world, not only physically but symbolically. Distance is maintained, access is controlled. Every interaction reinforces the idea of authority. A lesser-known detail is that access to the Sasanian king was often highly restricted, with multiple layers of officials and ceremonial practices designed to elevate the ruler's status and maintain a sense of almost sacred distance. You watch as a visitor is brought forward. Their approach is slow measured. There are pauses, gestures, moments where protocol must be followed precisely. It creates an atmosphere that feels almost theatrical, yet deeply meaningful. You begin to understand that power here is not only exercised, it is performed. It is presented in a way that shapes perception as much as reality. You move through the court, observing the clothing worn by those in different roles. Rich fabrics, detailed patterns, subtle distinctions that indicate rank and position. Even without words, the hierarchy is visible. Some researchers suggest that this emphasis on ceremony helped stabilize the empire by clearly defining social order and reinforcing loyalty to the central authority. Others question whether it also created distance between rulers and ordinary people, making governance less responsive to local needs. As you observe the interactions, both ideas seem possible. You continue walking and your attention shifts to the cultural life of the empire. Article, music, literature. They are not separate from power. They are supported by it, shaped by it, and in turn they reinforce it. You see intricate carvings that depict scenes of royal triumph and divine connection. The imagery is not random. It tells a story of legitimacy, of strength, of continuity with the past. You hear music played in a courtyard, the sound carrying gently through the air. It feels structured, composed, reflecting a culture that values balance and refinement. You realize that this empire is not only maintaining control, it is defining identity through culture. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of Sasanian artistic and cultural output was influenced by earlier Persian traditions versus new innovations unique to this period. As you look at the patterns and forms around you, you sense both continuity and creativity. You move toward a quieter area away from the central court. Here, daily life continues in a more familiar rhythm. People work, families gather, conversations unfold without the weight of ceremony. And yet even here, the influence of the larger system is present. You notice how people speak about authority with respect, with awareness. The structure of the empire shapes not only formal interactions but also everyday understanding. You pause near a group of individuals engaged in discussion. They speak about trade, about news from distant regions, about changes that affect their lives. There is a sense that they are part of something larger, even if they do not stand at its center. You think back to earlier moments in your journey, the small settlements, the gradual formation of identity. Now that identity feels more defined, more consciously expressed, not just lived, but understood. Scholars remain divided about how deeply this sense of imperial identity reached into rural areas and distant regions where local traditions may have remained stronger than centralized influence. As you observe the quieter spaces, you sense that the reach of the empire is broad but not uniform. You step outside as evening begins to settle once more. The city transitions smoothly from day to night. Lights appear softly, voices lower. The energy shifts from activity to calm. You take a slow breath, feeling the balance of this world. Power and ritual, structure and daily life, grandeur and quiet continuity. It all exists together. You realize that this period represents a peak, a moment where Persian identity is not only strong but clearly expressed in every aspect of life, from the highest court to the simplest home. You look up at the sky, the stars beginning to appear again. They feel familiar now, a constant presence throughout your journey. You think about how much has changed beneath them, and yet how much has remained. The desire for order, the search for meaning, the shaping of identity through both power and culture. You stand there for a moment, letting the quiet of the evening settle around you. The Sasanian world feels stable, confident, defined, but you have already learned that no structure remains unchanged forever. And somewhere beyond this moment, another shift is approaching. You move forward once more, and at first everything appears as it did before. The cities remain structured. The court still holds its rituals. The systems of power continue to function with quiet confidence. It feels as though this world could endure indefinitely. But beneath that surface, something new begins to approach. Not loudly, not suddenly, but steadily. You begin to hear of movements far to the southwest. Small at first, groups of people united not by empire but by belief. Their presence grows, gradually spreading across regions that once seemed firmly within the control of the Sasanian world. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that in the 7th century CE, Arab Muslim forces expanded rapidly out of the Arabian Peninsula, leading to the conquest of large parts of the Sasanian Empire and transforming the political and religious landscape of the region. You stand at the edge of this transformation. It does not feel like earlier invasions. There is no single overwhelming army visible from a distance. Instead, there is a series of movements, encounters, shifts that begin at the edges and move inward. You walk through a settlement where the first reports have arrived. The tone is uncertain. Not yet alarmed, but attentive. People speak of new leaders, of a new faith, of a different kind of unity that is not based on empire but on shared belief. You sense that this difference matters. A lesser known detail is that many local populations within the Sasanian Empire, including some religious minorities, may have initially viewed the incoming Arab forces with a degree of openness, particularly if they felt marginalized under existing structures. You reflect on how internal conditions shape the outcome of external events. Empires are not only challenged from outside, they are affected by what exists within. You continue walking and the signs of change become more visible. Military preparations begin, but they feel less confident than in earlier periods. The empire has already been weakened by prolonged conflicts, especially with the Romans, and its resources are stretched. You notice how this exhaustion affects everything. Decisions take longer. Coordination feels less precise. The sense of unity that once defined the empire begins to waver. Some researchers suggest that the rapid success of the Arab conquests was not only due to military effectiveness, but also to the weakened state of the Sasanian and Byzantine empires after years of war with each other. As you observe the situation, this explanation feels deeply relevant. You move closer to a place where confrontation is about to occur. The atmosphere is tense but quiet. There is no dramatic display, only preparation. You imagine the moment when these two worlds meet. On one side, an established empire with centuries of history, structure and tradition. On the other, a rapidly growing force united by a new religious vision. Historians still debate the exact reasons for the speed of the Sasanian collapse, with some emphasizing military defeats and others pointing to internal instability and shifting loyalties. As you stand here, it feels like a convergence of factors: pressure from outside, weakness from within, and a moment in time where change becomes inevitable. You hear of a battle, then another, each one bringing news that is harder to ignore. Territories fall, cities change hands. The structure that once felt unshakable begins to give way. You walk through a city where authority has shifted. The symbols of Sasanian power are still visible, but they no longer carry the same certainty. New voices emerge, new systems begin to take shape, and with them a new belief. You begin to hear words spoken with a different tone, not tied to older traditions, but connected to a faith that emphasizes unity, submission to a single divine will, and a new way of organizing society. You sense that this change is not only political, it is spiritual. You remember the fire temples, the steady flames, the ideas of order and duality that shaped earlier Persian belief. Now another framework is arriving, one that will not erase the past entirely but will reshape it in profound ways. Archaeologists continue discussing how much continuity existed between pre-Islamic and early Islamic practices in the region, as many cultural elements appear to have persisted beneath the surface of religious change. You begin to see that transformation does not mean disappearance. It means adaptation. You move through a quieter part of the city as evening approaches. People speak in softer tones now, some with concern, some with curiosity, some with cautious acceptance. The world is changing and each person responds in their own way. You pause, reflecting on everything you have seen. The rise of empires, the blending of cultures, the revival of identity, and now a shift that touches not only governance but belief itself. You feel the weight of this moment, not as an ending but as a turning point. Because what comes next will shape the identity of this land for centuries. The sky darkens gently above you. The familiar stars return, unchanged, watching as the structures below them transform once again. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle. The Sasanian world fades not abruptly, but gradually, and in its place a new chapter begins, one that will carry the memory of Persia forward even as it reshapes what Persia means. You move into a world that feels unfamiliar, at first yet strangely continuous beneath the surface. The structures of the Sasanian Empire have faded, but the land remains the same. The cities still stand, the roads still guide movement. The people continue their daily lives, though the language of power and belief has begun to shift. You hear new words spoken with growing confidence. Arabic phrases woven into convey references to a shared faith that extends far beyond this region. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that after the Arab conquest, the lands of Persia became part of the early Islamic caliphates, integrating into a vast political and religious system that stretched across much of the known world. And yet as you walk through this environment, you begin to notice something important. Persia does not disappear. It changes form. You move through a city where administrative systems continue to function, though now under new authority. The methods of governance feel familiar in certain ways, even if the names and structures have been adapted. A lesser-known detail is that many early Islamic administrators relied heavily on existing Persian bureaucratic practices, as they were already well developed and effective at managing large territories. You begin to see how influence works in both directions. The conquerors bring a new religious framework. The land they govern shapes how that framework is applied. You pass by a group of scholars engaged in discussion. Their language shifts between Arabic and Persian. Their ideas draw from multiple traditions. There is a sense of intellectual blending that feels different from the earlier Hellenistic period. This time, the blending's not just cultural, it is deeply tied to belief. Some researchers suggest that Persian scholars played a crucial role in shaping the intellectual foundations of Islamic civilization, contributing to fields such as philosophy, administration, and science. As you observe these discussions, it becomes clear that the flow of influence is not one-sided. You walk into a quieter space where people gather for prayer. The atmosphere is calm, structured, and focused. It differs from the fire temples you once saw, yet carries a similar sense of purpose. A connection between daily life and something greater. You reflect on how belief systems evolve. They do not always replace what came before completely. They absorb, adapt, reshape. You begin to notice how certain cultural elements remain present. Patterns in art, ways of speaking, social customs that continue quietly beneath the surface. It is as if the older identity has not vanished but has been woven into the new structure. Archaeologists continue discussing how deeply pre-Islamic Persian traditions influenced early Islamic culture in the region, as many practices appear to have persisted even as religious identity changed. You continue walking and the city reveals layers of continuity. Markets function as they did before. Trade routes remain active. People still move along familiar paths. The outward form has shifted, but the underlying rhythm endures. You think back to the earliest moments of your journey. The small settlements, the gradual formation of identity tied to the land. That connection has survived every transformation so far, and it continues here. You hear poetry being recited softly in a courtyard. The language carries a familiar cadence even as it incorporates new themes and influences. It feels like a bridge between past and present. You realize that culture is often more resilient than political structures. It adapts quietly, preserving what matters while allowing change to take place. Scholars remain divided about the extent to which Persian identity was consciously preserved during this period versus naturally continuing through everyday life and tradition. As you observe the environment around you, it feels less like a deliberate effort and more like an organic process. You move toward the edge of the city as the day begins to fade. The light softens, casting a calm tone over everything. You pause, looking back at what you have seen. An empire has fallen. A new system has taken its place. And yet the essence of Persia remains, not in the form of political power, but in language, culture, and ways of thinking. You begin to understand that this is one of the most important turning points in the story. Because from this moment forward, Persia is no longer an independent empire. It is part of a larger Islamic world. And yet it will continue to shape that world from within. You take a slow breath, letting the quiet settle around you. The stars begin to appear once more, steady and familiar. You feel a sense of continuity that runs deeper than any single era. The story is not about loss. It is a transformation, about how identity survives by adapting, by finding new forms, by continuing to exist even when the structures around it change completely. You stand there for a moment longer, feeling the layers of history beneath your feet, and you begin to sense that the influence of Persia is no longer defined by its borders. It is spreading quietly, shaping a civilization that reaches far beyond this land. You continue forward, and as the world settles into its new rhythm, you begin to notice something unexpected. Despite conquests, despite change, despite the adoption of a new religious and political framework, a familiar sound continues to echo quietly through the daily life. Language. You hear it in markets, in homes, in poetry, spoken softly at night. It does not disappear. It adapts, absorbs, reshapes itself, but it remains. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Persian language, also known as Farsi, survived the Arab conquest and continued to develop, eventually re-emerging as a major literary and cultural language within the Islam world. You walk through a gathering where a story is being told. The words flow with rhythm, carrying images of kings, heroes, and distant landscapes. Some of the vocabulary has changed. Arabic influences are present. But the structure, the feeling, the identity within the language remains distinctly Persian. You begin to understand that language is more than communication. It is memory. A lesser-known detail is that while Arabic became the dominant language of administration and religion in many early Islamic regions, Persian continued to be spoken widely and later experienced a literary revival, especially under local dynasties that valued cultural heritage. You imagine how this duality shaped daily life. Arabic for official matters, for scholarship tied to religious study. Persian for storytelling, for personal expression, for the continuity of cultural identity. You listen closely as a poet recites verses. The audience is quiet, attentive. Each word carries weight not only for its meaning, but for what it represents. A connection to the past, a preservation of identity. Some researchers suggest that the survival of Persian was not guaranteed, and that in other regions local languages faded more completely under similar conditions. The fact that Persian endured may reflect both the strength of its literary tradition and the social structures that supported it. As you reflect on this, you begin to see how language can act as a quiet form of resistance, not against change itself, but against complete erasure. You move through the city noticing how Persian appears in different forms, in casual conversation, in songs, in written texts that circulate among those who seek to preserve and expand its use. You begin to see the emergence of something new, a fusion, Persian written using the Arabic script. A blending of linguistic traditions that allows the language to continue evolving within the new cultural framework. You pause near a small group engaged in copying texts. Their movements are careful, deliberate, each word written with attention. You realize that this act is not only about recording information, it is preservation, about ensuring that the language continues to exist for future generations. Historians still debate the exact timeline and process through which Persian regained prominence as literary language, as much of this development occurred gradually and across different regions. As you observe the careful work of these individuals, you sense that this process is not driven by a single moment. It unfolds slowly, through countless small efforts. You continue walking, and the presence of language becomes even more apparent. You hear it in lullabies sung to children, in stories told by elders, in the way people describe the world around them. It shapes thought. It carries identity. It connects generations. You think back to the earlier empires, the systems of governance, the roads, the rituals. Many of those structures have changed or disappeared, but language remains. You begin to understand that this continuity is one of the strongest threads linking ancient Persia to the future. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of pre-Islamic Persian literature has been lost, as much of it was transmitted orally before being written down later. As you listen to the spoken stories, you sense that what survives is only part of a much larger, mostly unseen heritage, and yet even that part is powerful. You move toward a quieter area as evening begins to settle once more. The light softens. The sounds of the city become more gentle. You sit for a moment listening. The language around you feels steady, familiar, enduring. You realize that while political systems can change quickly, language moves at a different pace. It adapts, but it does not abandon itself easily. It carries forward what it can. It reshapes what it must. Scholars remain divided about how consciously Persian identity was preserved through language, versus how naturally it continued as part of daily life. As you reflect on everything you have seen, it feels like both. A quiet effort and a natural continuation. You look up at the sky, the stars appearing once more in their steady pattern. You think about how many generations have looked up at this same sky, speaking different words yet sharing a common thread through language. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle around you. The story of Persia is no longer written in the rise and fall of empires alone. It is carried in words, in sounds, in the way people speak, remember and imagine their place in the world. And as you sit there listening to the quiet flow of language around you, you begin to understand that this may be one of the most enduring legacies of all. You continue walking, and the world around you begins to feel more alive with thought. Not just movement or trade or governance, but ideas. The cities you pass through now carry a different kind of energy. There are places where people gather not only to exchange goods, but to exchange knowledge. Quiet rooms filled with scrolls, courtyards where discussions stretch long into the evening. You begin to sense that this is a new kind of power. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that during the early centuries of Islamic civilization, Persian scholars played a major role in what is often called the Islamic Golden Age, contributing to fields such as mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. You step into a place of learning. It is simple in structure yet filled with intention. Shelves hold carefully preserved texts, Individuals sit in focused silence, reading or writing, reflecting. The atmosphere is calm, almost meditative. You notice how knowledge is treated here, with respect, with patience, with a sense that understanding the world is itself a meaningful pursuit. A lesser-known detail is that many important works of ancient Greek philosophy and science were preserved, translated and expanded upon by scholars in Persian-influenced regions, allowing ideas that might have been lost to continue shaping future generations. You watch as a scholar carefully copies a text, pausing occasionally to reflect, to adjust to ensure accuracy. This is not hurried work, it is deliberate. You begin to understand that knowledge here is not only preserved, it is developed, expanded. You move to another part of the space where a small group is engaged in discussion. They speak about the nature of the universe, about numbers and patterns, about the movement of stars. Their conversation flows between languages, drawing from different traditions. It feels like a meeting point of worlds. Some researchers suggest that the intellectual flourishing of this period was made possible in part by the administrative and cultural foundations inherited from earlier Persian empires, which supported urban life, education, and the exchange of ideas. As you observe the environment around you, this connection begins to feel clear. You step outside briefly and the city around you reflects this intellectual energy. You see individuals carrying texts. You hear debates in open spaces. You notice how learning is not confined to a single place but woven into daily life. You return inside and come across a discussion about medicine. One person describes treatments based on observation and experience. Another questioned the method, suggesting improvements. There is a willingness to challenge ideas, to refine them, to seek better understanding. Historians still debate how much of this intellectual progress was driven by individual brilliance versus the broader environment that encouraged learning and exchange. As you listen to the conversation, it feels like both elements are essential. You begin to recognize that this period is not only about preserving knowledge from the past, it is about creating something new, a synthesis, where Persian, Greek, and other traditions come together to form a richer, more complex understanding of the world. You walk toward a quieter corner where an individual studies the stars through careful observation. There are no advanced instruments as you might imagine today, but there is precision in the way they record what they see. Patterns, movements, changes over time. You think back to the earliest people you encountered, looking up at the sky with quiet curiosity. Now that curiosity has become structured, systematic, driven by a desire to understand rather than simply observe. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of the scientific knowledge from this period has been accurately attributed, as many contributions were built upon earlier work and shared across cultures. As you reflect on this, it becomes clear that knowledge rarely belongs to a single source. It is cumulative, shared, evolving. You continue walking and the atmosphere gradually softens as evening approaches. The discussion's quiet. The work slows, but the presence of thought remains. You sit for a moment reflecting on what you have seen. The transformation of Persia has not diminished its influence. It has redirected it. From empire to intellect, from political dominance to cultural and scientific contribution, you begin to see how this shift will carry forward into the future. Because ideas travel differently than armies, they cross boundaries more easily. They persist even when political structures change. Scholars remain divided about how directly this intellectual period influenced later developments in Europe and beyond, but many agree that it played a significant role in preserving and advancing knowledge that would later spread further. You look up at the sky once more. The stars remain steady, unchanged, yet your understanding of them has deepened just as the people around you have sought to deepen theirs. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle. The world feels quieter now, more reflective. You realize that this stage of the journey is not marked by conquest or conflict, but by thought, by the quiet work of individuals seeking to understand the world and their place within it. And in that quiet work, the legacy of Persia continues to grow, not through expansion, but through knowledge. You continue forward and the world begins to feel less stable again, Not in a sudden or dramatic way, but in a slow shifting of control. The intellectual energy you have just experienced does not disappear, but the political structure surrounding it becomes more fragmented. Authority changes hands. Dynasties rise then fade. New rulers appear, each bringing their own approach, their own priorities, their own vision of what this land should be. You walk through a city where the name of the ruling power feels less permanent than before. It changes over time, spoken differently by different groups, reflecting the constant movement of authority across the region. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that after the early Islamic period, Persia experienced centuries of rule under various dynasties, including the Samanid dynasty, Ghaznavid Empire, and Seljuk Empire, each contributing to the development of what historians often call a Persianate cultural world. You begin to notice how this constant change does not erase identity. Instead, it reshapes how identity is expressed. You walk through a marketplace where different influences meet. Clothing styles reflect a mix of traditions. Languages blend in conversation. Customs adapt to new leadership while still holding on to familiar patterns. A lesser-known detail is that many of these ruling dynasties were not ethnically Persian themselves, yet they adopted Persian language, culture, and administrative practices as a way to legitimize their rule. You pause reflecting on this. Power changes hands, but culture remains influential. You begin to understand that Persian identity is no longer tied to a single ruling group. It exists beyond that. Some researchers suggest that this period marks the emergence of a broader Persian cultural sphere extending beyond the geographic boundaries of modern Iran into Central Asia and beyond. As you observe the diversity around you, this idea feels increasingly clear. You move through a quieter part of the city where scholars and poets continue their work. The intellectual life you saw earlier has not disappeared. It has adapted. Patrons of learning change, but the pursuit of knowledge continues. You hear poetry again, spoken with the same rhythm and depth as before. It carries themes of love, philosophy, and the passage of time. It reflects a culture that remains deeply expressive even as political conditions shift. Historians still debate how much stability existed during this period, as some regions experienced relative peace, while others faced ongoing conflict and power struggles. As you walk through the city, you sense both elements. Moments of calm, underlying tension. You continue moving and the landscape begins to shift again. You hear of new groups arriving from the east, movements that bring both disruption and transformation. You sense the approach of change once more. You imagine how it feels for those living here to see rulers change repeatedly, to adapt to new systems while maintaining continuity in daily life. You begin to realize that resilience has become a defining feature of this land. The ability to adjust without losing identity, to absorb influence without being fully reshaped by it. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of everyday life changed during these dynastic transitions, as much of the historical record focuses on elites rather than ordinary people. As you observe the quieter spaces, you sense that for many life continues with a familiar rhythm even as the names of rulers change. You walk toward the edge of the city as evening approaches. The light softens. The sounds of activity begin to fade. You pause, looking back at the layers of history that have unfolded. Empires rising and falling, cultures blending and evolving, identity shifting yet remaining. You think about how different this period feels compared to the earlier centralized empires. There is less singular control, more variation, more complexity, and yet there is also continuity. You begin to understand that this stage of the journey is not defined by one dominant power, but by the persistence of culture through change. Scholars remain divided about whether this period should be seen as one of fragmentation or as one of cultural flourishing despite political instability. As you stand here, both interpretations seem to exist together. You take a slow breath, letting the calm of the evening settle around you. The stars begin to appear once more, steady, unchanging. You feel a quiet sense of continuity that runs through everything you have seen. The land remains. The language continues. The culture adapts. You stand there for a moment longer, aware that change will come again as it always does, but also aware that something deeper endures, something that has carried Persia through every transformation so far, and will continue to carry it forward. You move forward again, and this time the change feels sharper, not gradual. gradual like before, not layered quietly over time, but focused, deliberate. You begin to sense the formation of something more defined, something that will shape not only the identity of this land, but its future in a way that feels unmistakable. You hear a new name rising with clarity: Safavid. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Safavid Empire emerged in the early 16th century and established a powerful state that would redefine Persia as a distinct political and religious entity. You walk into a city where this transformation is already visible. The structures of power feel more centralized again. Authority is clear. Direction is intentional. But what stands out most is not only governance, it is belief. You begin to notice that the religious landscape is shifting in a more defined way than before. A particular form of Islam, Shia Islam. You hear it spoken with conviction. You see it reflected in practice. You feel it in the way people describe their identity. A lesser-known detail is that the Safavid rulers actively promoted Twelver Shia Islam as the official state religion, even though much of the population had previously followed different interpretations of Islam. You pause, reflecting on what that means. This is not just a natural evolution of belief, it is deliberate shaping of identity. You walk through a gathering where religious scholars speak with authority. Their role feels more integrated with the state than before. Belief and governance are no longer parallel. They are connected. You begin to understand how powerful that connection can be. It creates unity. It defines belonging. It distinguishes this land from its neighbours. Some researchers suggest that the adoption of Shia Islam was partly a strategic decision, helping the Safavid rulers differentiate their state from the surrounding Sunni powers, particularly the Ottoman Empire. As you consider this, the political and religious dimensions of this change feel inseparable. You continue walking and the city reveals signs of this new identity. Architecture reflects religious symbolism more clearly. Public rituals carry a shared meaning that binds people together. The sense of collective identity feels stronger, more defined. You think back to earlier periods where identity was shaped by culture, language, and tradition. Now religion becomes a central pillar, not replacing those elements, but anchoring them. Historians still debate how quickly and completely this transformation took place, as the process of converting a diverse population to a unified religious identity would have taken time and faced resistance. As you observe the environment around you, you sense that this change is both powerful and complex. You move toward a quieter area where people speak more openly. You hear different perspectives. Some embrace the new identity with conviction. Others adjust gradually. A few remain uncertain. You begin to understand that even within a strong central vision, individual experiences vary. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of this religious transformation can be traced through material culture, as shifts in architecture, art and burial practices reflect deeper changes in belief. You notice these details around you. Symbols, designs, subtle changes that signal a broader shift. You walk toward a place of gathering as evening approaches. The atmosphere is calm yet filled with a meaning. People come together not only as individuals but as part of a shared identity that feels newly defined. You sit for a moment listening. The words spoken carry a different tone now. More unified, more certain. You think about how this moment connects to everything you have seen before. The early formation of identity, the blending of cultures, the survival of language. Now all of it converges into something more focused. A state that defines itself not only by history but by belief. Scholars remain divided about whether the Safavid transformation should be seen as a natural evolution of Persian identity or as a constructed shift driven by political necessity. As you sit there, it feels like both, a continuation of the past and a deliberate step into something new. The sky darkens slowly above you. The stars appear once more steady and familiar. You feel a sense of recognition. The land has changed many times, but this moment feels different, more defining, more lasting. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle. The Safavid world around you feels stable, purposeful, and deeply connected to the identity that will eventually shape modern Iran. You realize that you're no longer just observing another transformation. You're witnessing the foundation of something that will endure far into the future. You remain within this newly defined world, and as time moves gently forward, you begin to notice how deeply this transformation settles into daily life. It is no longer something new. It is becoming normal. The identity shaped under the Safavids is not only visible in grand structures or public rituals, it is carried quietly by individuals woven into their understanding of who they are and how they belong. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that under the Safavid Empire, Twelver Shia Islam became firmly established as the dominant religious identity of the region, shaping social structures, legal systems, and cultural expression in lasting ways. You walk through a neighborhood where families gather in the evening. The atmosphere is calm, conversations are soft, but the language people use reflects this shared belief. References to religious figures, stories passed down through generations, practices that feel both personal and communal. You begin to understand that identity here is no longer only cultural, it is spiritual, and it is collective. A lesser-known detail is that Safavid rulers often supported the development of religious institutions, encouraging scholars to formalize teachings and expand networks of education that would reinforce Shia doctrine across the population. You imagine how this influences the next generation, children growing up within a clearly defined framework, learning not only language and customs, but belief as a central part of their identity. You pause near a gathering where a story is being shared. It is not simply historical, it carries emotional weight. Themes of justice, sacrifice, memory. You sense how these narratives shape not only belief but values. Some researchers suggest that the emphasis on shared religious memory, particularly around key events and figures in Shia tradition, helped create a strong sense of unity and resilience within the population. As you listen, you begin to feel that unity. It is not loud, it is steady. You walk further and the physical environment reflects this identity as well. You see places designed for gathering, for reflection, for shared experience. The architecture feels intentional, not only functional but meaningful. Symbols appear in patterns and designs in spaces where people come together. Historians still debate how much of this cultural unity was achieved through voluntary adoption versus state enforcement, especially in the earlier stages of Safavid rule. As you observe the interactions around you, you sense that over time what may have begun as a directive has become internalized, part of everyday life. You continue moving and you notice how this shared identity influences behavior. There is a sense of belonging, of being part of something larger. You see it in the way people greet each other, in the way they support one another, in the way they speak about their place in the world. You think back to earlier periods in your journey, the fragmented identities, the blending of cultures, the shifting of rulers. Now there is a clarity that was not always present, a defined sense of who they are. You sit for a moment in a quiet space listening to the low sounds of evening. The rhythm of life feels steady, grounded. You begin to understand that this moment represents a kind of consolidation, not just of power, but of identity. Scholars remain divided about whether this strong integration of religion and identity limited diversity within the region or provided a necessary foundation for long-term cohesion. As you reflect on what you have seen, both perspectives feel possible. Unity can strengthen, but it can also shape boundaries. You stand again and walk toward the edge of the city. The sky above begins to deepen into night. The familiar stars appear once more. You feel a sense of continuity that connects this moment to everything that came before. The early communities, the great empires, the transformations of belief and power, all of it has led here, to a place where identity feels both inherited and defined. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle. The world around you is quieter now, more settled, but you sense that this stability exists within a larger context. Because beyond this land, other powers are rising, other influences are approaching, and even the most defined identities will eventually face new challenges. You stand there for a moment longer, aware that this is not an ending. It is a foundation, one that will shape how this land responds to everything that comes next. You move forward once more, and the sense of stability you just experienced begins to feel less certain, not because it disappears, but because the world around it is changing. The Safavid state remains strong, its identity clearly defined, its structures still intact. But beyond its borders, other powers are rising, expanding, pressing inward in ways that cannot be ignored. You begin to feel the pressure of a world that is becoming more connected, more competitive, more aware of itself. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that during the Safavid period, Iran found itself positioned between powerful neighbouring empires, particularly the Ottoman Empire to the west, and expanding forces from Central Asia and later Russia to the north. You walk toward the edge of the empire where this pressure is most visible. The atmosphere feels different here, more alert, more uncertain. You see soldiers stationed along key routes, their presence steady but watchful. Fortifications stand where the land narrows or opens into vulnerable terrain. The movement of people carries an awareness of borders that once felt more fluid. You begin to understand that identity once established must now be defended. A lesser-known detail is that the Safavid and Ottoman empires engaged in a series of prolonged conflicts, not only over territory but also over religious and political legitimacy, as each represented a different branch of Islam. You imagine the tension between these two worlds. On one side, a Sunni empire with its own traditions and authority. On the other, a Shia state defining itself in contrast. The conflict is not only physical, it is ideological. You move through a military encampment where preparations are ongoing. The atmosphere is disciplined but not hurried. There is a sense that this is part of a long struggle, not a single decisive moment. You hear conversations about strategy, about terrain, about the movement of forces across regions that are difficult to control completely. Some researchers suggest that geography played a crucial role in maintaining the balance between these empires, as mountains, deserts and distance made total domination by either side unlikely. As you observe the landscape around you, this idea feels clear. The land itself resists easy control. It shapes the limits of power. You walk further and the presence of external influence becomes more apparent. Traders arrive from distant regions. Envoys carry messages between courts. There is a growing awareness that the world extends far beyond the immediate conflict. Historians still debate how much these interactions with neighbouring empires and emerging European powers influenced internal developments within Safavid Iran. As you listen to the discussions around you, it becomes clear isolation is no longer possible. The empire must engage, adapt, respond. You move toward a quieter settlement where everyday life continues. People work, speak and gather as they always have, but there is a subtle change in tone, an awareness that the world is larger, more interconnected, more uncertain than before. You notice how identity once formed now carries a different weight. It is not only about belonging, it is about distinction, about defining who you are in relation to others. Archaeologists continue discussing how border regions in particular developed unique cultural blends influenced by both Persian and neighbour cultural and traditions. As you observe the people around you, you see hints of this blending. Clothing styles that reflect multiple influences, languages that shifted depending on context, customs that adapt while maintaining core elements. You begin to understand that borders are not only lines of division, they are spaces of interaction, of exchange, of complexity. You walk back toward the centre as this evening approaches. The city feels familiar again, yet the awareness of the wider world remains present. You sit for a moment reflecting. The Safavid state has created a strong identity, but that identity exists within a world that is constantly shifting. You think back to earlier moments in your journey, the rise of empires, the blending of cultures, the shaping of belief. Now all of those elements must interact with forces beyond the land itself. Scholars remain divided about whether the Safavid period should be seen as a time of strength or as the beginning of long-term challenges due to external pressures. As you consider this, it feels like both. Strength within, pressure from outside. You look up at the sky as it darkens once more. The stars appear steady and unchanged. You feel a sense of continuity that runs deeper than any conflict. And yet you also sense that the world is becoming more dynamic, more unpredictable. You take a slow breath, letting the calm settle. The empire stands at a crossroads, defined by its past, shaped by its identity, and now facing a future that will require new forms of adaptation. You remain there for a moment longer, aware that the story is moving toward another turning point, one that will challenge everything that has been built so far. You continue forward, and the strength you once felt in this land begins to soften, not all at once, Not in a single moment, but gradually like a structure that still stands yet shows small signs of strain. The Safavid world you have come to know remains visible in its identity, in its traditions, in its belief. But its political stability begins to weaken and new forces, quieter but persistent, start to shape its future. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that by the 18th century the Safavid Empire had entered a period of decline weakened by internal struggles, economic challenges and external pressures. You walk through a city that still carries the marks of earlier grandeur. The architecture remains impressive. The streets still follow their careful design. But something feels different, less certain. You notice how authority is no longer as clearly expressed. Officials move with less confidence. Decision seems slower, less coordinated. There is no single visible collapse. Only a quiet erosion. A lesser-known detail is that economic difficulties, including disruptions in trade routes and declining revenues, played a significant role in weakening the Safavid state, even as its cultural identity remained strong. You pass through a marketplace where activity continues, but with a different tone. Traders speak cautiously. Goods are fewer. Prices shift in ways that reflect instability rather than growth. You begin to understand how economic change affects everything else. Power relies on resources. And when those resources begin to falter, the structure above them becomes vulnerable. Some researchers suggest that internal divisions among political elites and weakening central authority contributed just as much to the decline as external threats. As you observe the interactions around you, you sense a lack of unity, not openly expressed but present in subtle ways. You move toward the edges of the city where news arrives from beyond. There are reports of foreign influence increasing, of neighbouring powers taking greater interest in this land, of pressure building not through immediate conquest but through gradual involvement. You begin to feel the shift from internal decline to external influence. Historians still debate the relative importance of different factors in the Safavid collapse, with some emphasising internal mismanagement and others pointing to the growing power of surrounding empires. As you reflect on everything you have seen, it feels like a combination. Weakness within invites pressure from outside. You walk through a quieter neighbourhood where daily life continues. People still gather, still speak, still maintain the cultural and religious identity that has been shaped over centuries. This continuity stands in contrast to the uncertainty of political power. You begin to understand that identity can remain stable even when governance does not. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of ordinary life changed during this period of decline, as much of the surviving record focuses on elite experiences. As you observe the quieter spaces, you sense that for many life continues with familiar rhythms, even as larger structures weaken. You pause, reflecting on how this moment connects to earlier parts of your journey, the rise of centralized power, the formation of identity, the challenges of maintaining both over time. Now you see how even strong systems can begin to fade. Not because they are suddenly destroyed, but because they are gradually worn down. You walk further and the presence of foreign influence becomes more visible. You hear different languages spoken. You see goods arriving from distant places. You sense that decisions affecting this land are increasingly shaped by forces beyond its borders. This is a different kind of power, less direct, more subtle, but no less significant. Scholars remain divided about whether this period should be viewed primarily as decline or as a transition toward a new phase shaped by global interaction. As you stand within it, it feels like both loss of control and the beginning of something else. You move toward the edge of the city as evening approaches. The light softens. The sounds of the day begin to fade. You sit for a moment, letting the quiet settle. The world around you feels familiar yet uncertain. You think about how many times this land has transformed, how many empires have risen and fallen, how many identities have been shaped and reshaped, and yet something always remains. You look up at the sky, the stars appearing once more. Steady, unchanging. You take a slow breath, feeling the calm return. The Safavid world is fading but not disappearing completely. Its identity, its culture, its influence will continue even as its political structure weakens. You remain there for a moment longer, aware that the next phase of this journey will bring new forms of power, new challenges, and new ways of understanding what it means to be Iran. You move forward again, and this time the change feels more conscious, less like a quiet fading, and more like an attempt to reshape what has been lost. The world around you is no longer dominated by a single powerful empire. Instead, authority feels fragmented, contested, uncertain, but within that uncertainty, new ideas begin to emerge. Ideas about control, about fairness, about limiting power. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that in the early 20th century, Iran experienced the Persian constitutional revolution, a movement that sought to establish a constitution and create a system where royal authority would be balanced by law. You walk into a city where tension is visible in a different way than before, not through armies preparing for battle, but through gatherings of people. Crowds form in public spaces, discussions grow louder. There is a sense of urgency, but also purpose. You begin to hear new words spoken with conviction. Justice, representation, law. These ideas feel different from the earlier focus on empire identity or belief. They are about structure, about how power should function. A lesser-known detail is that merchants, clerics, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens all played roles in the constitutional movement, creating a broad coalition that reflected diverse interests and motivations. You imagine the complexity of that alliance. Different groups coming together, not because they are identical, but because they share a common goal. To change the system, you move closer to a gathering where individuals speak openly. Their voices carry a mix of hope and frustration. They speak about limits on authority, about the need for accountability, about the idea that power should not be absolute. Some researchers suggest that exposure to European political ideas influence parts of the constitutional movement, while others emphasize internal factors such as dissatisfaction with corruption and economic hardship. As you listen, both influences feel present, external ideas meeting internal conditions. You begin to understand that this moment represents a shift in how people think about governance, not as something given, but as something that can be shaped. Historians still debate how successful the constitutional revolution truly was, as the establishment of a parliament and legal framework faced ongoing challenges and resistance from entrenched power structures. As you observe the environment around you, you sense both progress and difficulty. New systems being built, old systems resisting change. You walk through a street where posters and written messages appear. They carry ideas. Arguments, calls for reform. The written word becomes a tool of change, spreading ideas beyond individual conversations. You notice how language once again plays a crucial role. Just as it preserved identity in earlier periods, it now carries political thought. You pause near a group of individuals engaged in discussion. Their tone is intense but controlled. They debate, question, challenge one another. This is not a unified movement. It is a dynamic one. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of this period can be understood through surviving documents, as much of the experience of ordinary people remains less visible in the historical record. As you observe the interactions around you, you sense that this moment is lived in many different ways. For some it is a time of hope, for others uncertainty, for many both at once. You continue walking and the presence of authority feels different. The ruler is still there. The structure of monarchy remains, but it is no longer absolute. It is being questioned, defined, limited. You begin to understand how significant that shift is, because it changes not only how power is exercised, but how it is understood. Scholars remain divided about whether the constitutional revolution marked a true transformation of Iranian political culture or a partial change that left deeper structures intact. As you reflect on what you have seen, it feels like the beginning of something rather than its completion. A step, not a final state. You move towards the edge of the city as evening approaches. The light softens. The crowds begin to disperse. The intensity of the day gives way to a quieter rhythm. You sit for a moment, letting the calm return. The ideas you have encountered linger. They do not fade with the day. They continue to exist in the minds of those who carry them forward. You think back to earlier stages of your journey, the formation of empires, the shaping of identity. Now you see a new layer added, the questioning of power itself. You look up at the sky, the stars appearing once more, steady, unchanged. You take a slow breath, feeling the quiet settle. This moment feels different from those before. less about raison, more about possibility. And as you sit there, you begin to sense that the path ahead will not be simple, but yet it will be shaped by the ideas that have just begun to take root. You continue forward, and the energy of reform you just witnessed begins to take a different shape. The ideas of constitutional limits and shared power do not disappear, but they are overtaken by a new force, one that feels more direct, more controlled, more focused on transformation from above rather than pressure from below. You begin to hear a new name spoken with authority: Reza Khan. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that Reza Shah Pahlavi rose to power in the early 20th century and established the Pahlavi dynasty, initiating a period of rapid modernization and centralization in Iran. You walk into a city that feels different almost immediately. The structure is still there. The identity shaped over centuries remains present, but the direction has changed. You notice how authority becomes more concentrated again. Decisions are made with clarity and enforced with determination. There is less open debate in public space. More emphasis on order, on progress, on building something new. A lesser-known detail is that Reza Shah pursued policies aimed at reducing the influence of traditional power structures, including tribal leaders and certain religious authorities, in order to strengthen the central state. You begin to see how this reshapes society. Old systems are challenged, some are weakened, others are redefined. You walk along a street where construction is underway. New buildings rise with designs that reflect modern influences. The architecture feels different from what you have seen before, more aligned with global trends, less tied to older styles. You sense a deliberate effort to reshape not only governance but appearance. Some researchers suggest that this period of modernization was inspired in part by a desire to align Iran with Western models of development, while others emphasize internal motivations to strengthen the state and reduce fragmentation. As you observe the changes, both influences seem present. You continue walking and you notice how daily life begins to adjust. Clothing styles shift, education systems expand, new institutions appear. The pace of change feels faster than in earlier periods, more immediate. Historians still debate how widely these changes were accepted, as some segments of society embraced modernization, while others resisted the loss of traditional structures. As you move through different parts of the city, you see this contrast. In some areas, the new order feels natural. In others, it feels imposed. You pause near a group of individuals discussing the changes. Their tone is mixed. Some speak with optimism, others with concern. You begin to understand that transformation is rarely uniform. It affects people differently depending on their position, their beliefs, their experiences. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of everyday life changed during this period versus how much continuity remained beneath the surface. As you observe the quieter spaces, you sense that while outward appearances shift deeper, cultural patterns persist. You walk toward a place of education, a school where young people are learning new subjects, new ways of thinking. The atmosphere feels structured, forward-looking. There is an emphasis on progress and on preparing for a future that is different from the past. You think back to the earlier periods of intellectual growth, the scholars, the preservation of knowledge. Now that tradition continues, but within a different framework, more centralized, more directed. You begin to see how this moment represents another turning point, not just in governance, but in how the nation sees itself, no longer only shaped by its past, but actively redefining its future. Scholars remain divided about whether the Pahlavi modernization should be seen as a necessary step toward development or as a disruption of traditional social structures that created long-term tensions. As you reflect on what you have seen, it feels like both progress and pressure. You move toward the edge of the city as evening approaches. The light softens. The sounds of construction fade into quieter rhythms. You sit for a moment, letting the calm settle. The world around you feels both familiar and new. The identity of the land remains, but its expression is changing. You look up at the sky, the stars appearing once more. Steady, unchanged. You take a slow breath, feeling the quiet return. The path ahead is no longer defined only by history. It is shaped by decisions being made in the present. And as you sit there, you begin to sense that this period of transformation will lead to tensions that have not yet fully revealed themselves. You continue forward, and as the pace of modernization settles into the fabric of daily life, another force begins to rise quietly beneath it. It's not visible in architecture at first, not in clothing or education, but in something deeper, in the ground itself. Oil. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that Iran became one of the world's most important oil-producing regions in the 20th century, beginning with major discoveries in the early 1900s that would transform its economy and global significance. You walk toward an area where this change becomes visible. The land looks different here. Industrial. Structured for extraction rather than habitation. You see machinery operating steadily, drawing resources from beneath the surface. It feels like a different kind of connection to the land, not through agriculture or settlement, but through energy. A lesser-known detail is that early oil concessions in Iran were often controlled by foreign companies, particularly British interests, which led to significant tensions over ownership, profit, and national sovereignty. You begin to understand that this resource brings both opportunity and conflict, wealth and dependency. You move through a nearby settlement where workers live. Their lives are shaped by this new industry, their routines tied to the rhythm of extraction. You hear conversations about wages, about conditions, about the presence of foreign influence. There is a sense that something valuable is being taken, but not always fairly distributed. Some researchers suggest that control over oil became one of the most important factors in shaping Iran's political development during this period, influencing both domestic policy and international relations. As you observe the interactions around you, this influence feels unmistakable. You continue walking, and the presence of global interest becomes more apparent. You hear different languages. You see individuals who are not from this land yet are deeply involved in its resources. You begin to sense how Iran is no longer only shaping its own future. It's becoming part of a global system. Historians still debate the extent to which foreign involvement in Iran's oil industry limited its independence versus contributing to its modernization. As you reflect on what you have seen, both perspectives seem present. Development and constraint. You walk toward a gathering where people speak about these changes. Their tone carries frustration, concern, and a growing awareness of inequality. You begin to understand that this moment is not only about economics. It is about control. Who owns the resources? Who benefits from them? Who decides their future? Archaeologists continue discussing how industrialization affected traditional ways of life in regions where oil extraction became dominant, as the shift from rural to industrial environments brought both opportunity and disruption. As you observe the community around you, you see this duality, new possibilities, and new challenges. You move back towards the city as evening approaches. The contrast becomes clear. In one part of the land, tradition and culture continue. In another, industry reshapes everything. You begin to see how these worlds exist side by side, not fully integrated, not fully separate. You pause, reflecting on how this moment connects to everything you have seen before. The formation of empires, the shaping of identity, the influence of belief. Now a new force enters the story. Natural resources, and with them global attention. Scholars remain divided about whether oil ultimately strengthened Iran by increasing its strategic importance or created vulnerabilities by attracting foreign intervention. As you consider this, it feels like both power and exposure. You sit for a moment, letting the quiet settle as the day fades. The sounds of the city soften. The distant hum of machinery continues, a reminder that change is still ongoing. You look up at the sky, the stars appearing once more. Steady, unchanged. You take a slow breath, feeling the calm return. The land beneath you holds immense value, and that value is now shaping the path ahead. You realize that the story is moving toward a point where these tensions between modernization, control, identity, and external influence begin to converge. And when they do, the result will reshape everything once again. You continue forward, and the world around you begins to feel more divided. Not in visible lines across the land, but in the atmosphere itself. On the surface, modernization continues. Roads expand, buildings rise, institutions grow stronger. The vision of progress still moves forward with confidence. But beneath it, something quieter is building. a tension that does not always show itself openly yet touches everything. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that during the reign of Muhammad, Reza Shah Pahlavi Iran underwent rapid modernization and westernization, particularly through programs such as the White Revolution, which aimed to transform the country's economy and society. You walk through a city that reflects this transformation clearly. Modern buildings stand alongside older structures. New forms of education, media, and culture become more visible. The influence of the outside world feels stronger than ever before. You notice how daily life begins to shift. Clothing styles change. Entertainment evolves. The pace of life feels faster, more connected to global trends. A lesser-known detail is that while these reforms brought economic growth and expanded infrastructure, they also disrupted traditional social structures, particularly in rural areas, where changes to land ownership and agriculture altered long-established ways of life. You move through a quieter neighborhood where these changes are less visible. Here traditions remain strong. Practices continue as they have for generations. But even here, the influence of modernization can be felt. Subtle, gradual. You begin to understand that not everyone experiences change in the same way. Some embrace it, some resist it. Many feel caught between two worlds. Some researchers suggest that the speed of modernization created a gap between different parts of society, leading to feelings of disconnection and uncertainty. As you observe the interactions around you, this gap becomes more apparent. You hear conversations where people express different views. Some speak of progress, of opportunity, of a future aligned with the modern world. Others speak of loss, of identity, of values that feel threatened. Historians still debate whether the policies of this period could have succeeded if implemented more gradually, or if the underlying tensions were inevitable given the scale of change. As you reflect on what you see, it feels like the pace itself plays a significant role. You walk toward a public space where people gather. The atmosphere is not openly confrontational, but it carries an undercurrent of unease. Voices are careful, expressions measured. There is a sense that not everything can be said freely. You begin to notice how power is expressed, more centralized, more controlled. There is progress, but also restriction. Archaeologists continue discussing how everyday life reflected these tensions, as material culture from this period shows both increasing modern influence and continued attachment to traditional forms. As you move through the city, you see this contrast everywhere. Modern shops beside traditional markets, new ideas alongside old beliefs. You pause, reflecting on how this moment connects to the long history you have witnessed. The shaping of identity through belief, the survival of language, the blending of cultures. Now all of these elements are interacting with rapid modernization and external influence. The balance feels fragile. Scholars remain divided about whether this period represents a high point of development or the beginning of deeper instability that would lead to dramatic change. As you consider this, it feels like both growth and tension. You walk toward the edge of the city as evening approaches. The light softens. The sounds of the day begin to fade. You sit for a moment, letting the calm settle. The world around you feels full of potential, but also uncertainty. You look up at the sky, the stars appearing once more. Steady, unchanged. You take a slow breath, feeling the quiet return. The forces that have been building beneath the surface are not yet fully visible, but they are there, waiting. And as you sit there, you begin to sense that the next moment in this story will not be gradual. It will arrive with a force that reshapes everything. You move forward, and the quiet tension you once felt beneath the surface begins to rise. At first, it is subtle. A shift in tone, a growing intensity in conversations, a sense that something long building is beginning to move. Then gradually, it becomes impossible to ignore. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Iranian Revolution was the result of widespread dissatisfaction with political authority, social inequality, and cultural change, ultimately leading to the overthrow of the monarchy. You walk through a city where the atmosphere feels charged, not chaotic, but focused. People gather in larger numbers now. Their voices carry further. Their expressions are more open, more determined. You begin to understand that this is not a single event. It is a movement, a convergence of many different concerns brought together by a shared desire for change. A lesser known detail is that the revolution was not driven by a single group, but included a wide range of participants from religious leaders to students, workers, and intellectuals, each with their own vision of what the future should look like. You move closer to a gathering where individuals speak with intensity. Their words reflect frustration, hope, and a deep sense of urgency. You hear discussions about justice, about independence, about identity. These ideas echo earlier moments in your journey, but now they are sharper, more immediate. Some researchers suggest that the revolution was shaped not only by internal dissatisfaction, but also by perceptions of foreign influence and a desire to reclaim control over the nation's direction. As you listen, you begin to see how history has layered itself into this moment. The legacy of empire, the shaping of identity, the impact of modernization, all of it converging. You walk through a street where signs and messages are visible, not only written, but carried in voices, in movement, in presence. There is a sense that the people themselves are becoming the force of change. Historians still debate whether the revolution could have taken a different path, as multiple groups initially worked together but later diverged in their visions for the future. As you observe the unity in this moment, you sense both its strength and its fragility. You continue moving, and the presence of authority begins to shift. The structures that once felt firm now appear uncertain. Decisions are no longer accepted without question. Control becomes harder to maintain. You notice how quickly momentum builds, how once quiet dissatisfaction becomes collective action. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of this period can be understood through material and visual records, as the lived experience of individuals is often captured only in fragments. As you walk through the city, you sense those fragments everywhere, in the expressions of people, in the rhythm of movement, in the atmosphere itself. You pause near a group that is quieter than the others. Their conversation is more reflective. They speak about what comes next, about what kind of system will replace the one that is being challenged. You begin to understand that change is not only about ending something, it is about creating something new, and that process is not always clear. You think back to earlier moments in your journey, the rise of empires, the shaping of belief, the persistence of identity. Now you see all of those elements intersecting in a single moment of transformation. Scholars remain divided about the primary driving forces behind the revolution, with some emphasizing economic conditions, others focusing on political repression, and still others highlighting cultural and religious factors. As you reflect on everything you have seen, it feels like all of these forces are present, layered, interconnected. You move toward the edge of the city as evening approaches. The light softens, but the energy remains. This is not a moment that fades easily into quiet. It continues even as the day ends. You sit for a moment, letting your breath slow. The sounds around you are different now, more intense, more alive. You look up at the sky, the stars appearing once more, steady, unchanged. You take a slow breath, feeling the calm settle gently within you, even as the world around you moves with urgency. You realize that you are witnessing a turning point unlike any before. Not a gradual, but a moment where history accelerates, where the direction of a nation changes. And as you sit there, you begin to sense that what emerges from this moment will carry both the weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future. You move forward, and the intensity of the moment begins to settle into a new form. The energy of revolution does not disappear, but it changes. What was once movement becomes structure. What was once demand becomes system. You begin to see the outline of a new kind of state. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that after the Iranian Revolution, Iran was transformed into the Islamic Republic of Iran, a political system that combines elements of republican governance with religious authority. You walk through a city that feels both familiar and different. The buildings remain, the streets follow the same paths, but the atmosphere has shifted. There is a new sense of purpose, a new structure guiding how life is organized. You begin to notice how authority is expressed differently, not only through political institutions, but through religious leadership. You hear a name spoken with significance, Ruhollah Khomeini. You sense how his influence shapes the direction of this new system. A lesser-known detail is that the new government introduced the concept of guardianship of the jurist, a system in which a senior religious figure holds ultimate authority over certain aspects of the state. You reflect on how this connects to earlier moments in your journey, the Safavid integration of religion and identity, the long tradition of belief shaping governance. Now those elements are brought into a modern political framework. Some researchers suggest that this system represents a unique model, combining religious legitimacy with elements of electoral participation, while others question how these components balance in practice. As you observe the environment around you, you sense both structure and complexity. You walk through a public space where people gather. The tone is calmer than during the revolution, but still engaged. There is discussion, debate, a sense that the direction of the nation matters deeply. You notice how identity feels reinforced, not only culturally but ideologically. There is a clear sense of belonging to a system that defines itself through both faith and governance. Historians still debate how much continuity exists between this system and earlier forms of Persian rule, particularly in terms of centralized authority and the role of ideology in legitimizing power. As you reflect on everything you have seen, you begin to notice patterns, different forms, similar underlying structures. You move through quieter areas where daily life continues. Families gather, children learn. People move through routines that feel familiar despite the larger changes. You begin to understand that while political systems can transform rapidly, daily life often adapts more gradually. Archaeologists continue discussing how modern historical transitions are experienced differently across social groups, as the effects of change vary depending on location, class, and perspective. As you observe the people around you, you see that diversity of experience. Some feel a sense of alignment with the new system. Others adjust more cautiously. Many simply continue their lives within the new structure. You pause near a place of learning. Students engage with ideas that reflect both tradition and modernity. There is an effort to balance past and present, to define a future that is rooted in identity. You think back to the long journey that has brought you here, from early settlements to vast empires, to cultural resilience, to revolution. Now all of those layers are present within this new state. Scholars remain divided about how this system will evolve over time as it continues to respond to internal needs and external pressures. As you stand within it, you sense that it is still forming, still adapting, still defining itself. You move toward the edge of the city as evening approaches. The light softens. The sounds of the day begin to fade. You sit for a moment, letting the calm return. The intensity of earlier events has settled into a quieter rhythm. But the significance remains. You look up at the sky, the stars appearing once more. Steady, unchanged. You take a slow breath, feeling the quiet deepen. The story has entered the present, but the past is still here, layered beneath everything, shaping how this moment unfolds. And as you sit there, you begin to sense that the connection between ancient Persia and modern Iran is no longer something distant. It is something alive. Continuing. You continue forward, and now the world around you feels unmistakably modern. The streets are busier. The sounds are different. The rhythm of life moves faster, shaped by technology, communication, and global connection. And yet beneath all of this, you begin to notice something familiar. Patterns that echo what you have seen before. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the Islamic Republic of Iran operates through a complex political system that includes elected institutions alongside religious leadership, creating a structure that is both modern and rooted in historical traditions. You walk through a city where these layers exist side by side. Government buildings stand alongside religious centers. Modern infrastructure connects spaces that once felt distant, but authority is not expressed in a single form. It is shared, structured, balanced in ways that are not always immediately visible. You begin to understand that power here is not simple. It moves through different channels, some visible, some less so. A lesser-known detail is that Iran's political system includes multiple institutions with overlapping responsibilities, which can create both flexibility and complexity in how decisions are made. You pause near a group of people discussing current events. Their conversation reflects awareness, engagement, a sense that the direction of the nation is something that matters in everyday life. You notice how history continues to shape these discussions. References to past events, to identity, to the role of belief in defining the present. Some researchers suggest that the structure of modern Iranian governance reflects a long historical pattern of combining centralized authority with ideological legitimacy. A pattern that can be traced back to earlier empires and religious systems. As you reflect on this, you begin to see the continuity, different forms, similar foundations. You walk through a quieter area where daily life unfolds. Families gather. People move through routines that feel grounded and familiar. Despite the complexity of the political system, life continues with a steady rhythm. You begin to understand that the experience of a nation is not only defined by its institutions, it is lived by its people. Historians still debate how much of modern Iranian identity is shaped by ancient Persian heritage versus more recent historical developments. As you observe the environment around you, it feels like both are present, interwoven. You move toward a place of learning. Students engage with ideas that reflect both global influences and local traditions. There is a sense of connection to the wider world, but also a strong awareness of identity. You think back to earlier moments in your journey, the intellectual life of the Islamic Golden Age, the preservation of knowledge. Now that tradition continues adapted to a new context. Archaeologists continue discussing how material culture in modern Iran reflects layers of historical influences. Architecture, art, and everyday objects often carry traces of earlier periods. As you look around, you see those traces in patterns, in designs, in the way spaces are organized. You begin to realize that this past is not something separate. It is present, embedded. You walk toward the edge of the city as evening approaches. The light softens. The sounds of the day begin to fade. You sit for a moment, letting the calm settle. The modern world around you feels complex yet familiar in its deeper patterns. You think about how this moment connects to everything that came before. The rise of empires, the shaping of belief, the survival of language, the transformation of governance. All of it leading to this, a system that carries both history and change. Scholars remain divided about how the balance between tradition and modernity will evolve in Iran's future as the nation continues to navigate internal and external challenges. As you reflect on what you have seen, it feels like that balance is ongoing, not fixed, not complete. You look up at the sky, the stars appearing once more. Stay. Unchanged. You take a slow breath, feeling the quiet deepen. The story has reached the present, but it is not finished, because the past continues to shape what comes next. And as you sit there, you begin to sense that the influence of Persia has not faded. It has simply taken on new forms. You remain in the present, and as the world settles into a quieter rhythm, you begin to notice something that has been there all along. A presence that does not announce itself loudly, a shadow that stretches across time. Persia, not as an empire, not as a political structure, but as an idea. A widely accepted historical fact tells us that the cultural and historical legacy of ancient Persia continues to influence modern Iran in areas such as language, art, governance, and national identity. You walk slowly through a space that feels both modern and deeply rooted. The buildings around you are contemporary, yet their patterns, their designs, their sense of symmetry carry echoes of earlier times. You begin to see how history does not disappear. It settles into the background, becomes part of how things are done. A lesser-known detail is that many modern Iranian traditions, including elements of celebration storytelling and even administrative thinking, can be traced back through layers of history to pre-Islamic Persian practices. You pause, reflecting on how continuity works, not as a direct line, but as a series of echoes. You hear language spoken around you and you recognize its depth. Words that have carried meaning across centuries, expressions that connect the present to the past. You remember the poets, the scholars, the voices that preserved identity through language. They are still here, not physically, but through what they created. Some researchers suggest that the concept of Iranian identity today is a blend of ancient Persian heritage and later Islamic influence, forming something that cannot be separated into simple categories. As you observe the world around you, this blend feels natural, not forced. You walk through a gathering where people speak about their country. Their tone carries pride, complexity, awareness. They reference history not as something distant, but as something that defines who they are. Historians still debate how consciously modern Iranians engage with their ancient past versus how much of that influence exists implicitly through culture and tradition. As you listen, you sense both an awareness of history and a natural continuation of it. You move through a quieter area where art is displayed. Patterns, colours, designs that feel familiar. You recognize elements that have appeared throughout your journey. Adapted, refined, but still connected. Archaeologists continue discussing how material culture reflects long-term continuity, as certain motifs and styles persist across centuries even as their meanings evolve. You begin to see how this continuity creates a sense of depth, a feeling that this present is layered over a vast foundation. You sit for a moment letting the quiet settle. You think back to the beginning of your journey, the early settlements, the formation of identity, the rise and fall of empires, the transformation of belief, the persistence of language, all of it leading here to a moment where the past is not gone, it is present. You begin to understand that Persia never truly disappeared. It changed, adapted, moved through time in different forms. Scholars remain divided about whether it is more accurate to see modern Iran as a continuation of ancient Persia, or as a distinct entity shaped by many influences. As you reflect on everything you have seen, it feels like both continuity and transformation. You look up at the sky, the stars appearing once more, the same stars that have watched every stage of this story, from the earliest communities to the modern world. You take a slow breath, feeling the calm deepen. The idea of Persia is not something fixed. It is something that lives within the culture, the language, the identity of the people. And as you sit there, you begin to sense that this shadow of the past is not something that fades. It moves forward, quietly, shaping the future in ways that are not always visible but always present. You remain where you are, and as the present slowly settles into stillness, the long journey behind you begins to soften, not disappear, but quiet itself. You think back to where it all began, a wide plateau, scattered settlements, small communities, and to survive under an open sky. No empire, no clear identity, only the early threads of something that would take thousands of years to fully reveal itself. A widely accepted historical understanding tells us that the land once known as Persia evolved through countless transformations, eventually becoming what we now call Iran, a nation shaped by layers of history rather than a single defining moment. You let that thought rest gently in your mind, because what you have seen is not a straight line. It is a slow unfolding. You remember the rise of great empires, the order of the Achaemenids, the blending of cultures after Alexander, the resilience of the Parthians, the revival under the Sasanians. Each moment felt complete in itself, and yet each one became part of something larger. A lesser-known detail is that many of the cultural and administrative ideas developed in ancient Persia continued to influence later society far beyond its borders, quietly shaping systems that still exist in different forms today. You sit with that idea for a moment. That influence does not always appear where you expect it. It moves quietly. You recall the arrival of Islam, not as an ending but as transformation, a new layer added to what already existed. You remember how language carried identity forward, how knowledge flourished, how culture adapted without losing itself. You think of the Safavid moment, when belief and identity came together in a way that defined the nation more clearly than ever before. And then the modern era. Change accelerating, oil rising from beneath the land, global forces pressing inward, revolution reshaping everything in a single moment of intensity. And finally, the present, a place where all of these layers exist at once. Some researchers suggest that Iran's strength as a nation lies in this deep historical continuity, while others question whether the weight of the past sometimes complicates the path forward. As you reflect, both ideas feel true. You realize that history is not only something that explains the present, it is something that lives within it. Historians still debate how much of ancient Persian identity directly influences modern Iran versus how much has been reshaped by more recent developments. But as you sit quietly, that question feels less important than the experience itself, because you have seen the continuity, felt it, watched it unfold. You look around you now. The modern world feels calm, steady, but beneath it there is depth, layers of memory, of identity, of meaning that stretch far beyond what is immediately visible. Archaeologists continue discussing how much of this long continuity can be traced through physical evidence, and how much exists in intangible forms such as language tradition and shared understanding. You begin to understand that both matter, what can be seen, and what is simply carried forward. You take a slow breath. The air feels softer now, the pace of the story slowing. You look up at the sky one last time. The stars are there just as they were at the beginning, unchanged, watching everything unfold across time. You imagine the earliest people who stood under this same sky, looking up, wondering, beginning a story they could not yet see, and now you are here. At the end of that long unfolding, not an ending really, but a quiet pause, a moment where everything connects. You let your thoughts settle gently. The empires fade into the distance, the voices soften, the movement of history slows. All that remains is a sense of continuity, a feeling that time is not something that breaks, but something that flows, softly, endlessly. And as you rest there, the story of Persia and Iran becomes less about events and more about presence. A quiet, enduring presence that moves through centuries without ever truly disappearing. You allow that thought to drift, to become lighter. The world around you grows still, the past and present blending into something calm, something peaceful. And as your mind begins to rest, the journey fades into the distance, leaving only a quiet sense of understanding. A long story gently closing. Sweet dreams.